Chapter 648. Dear readers, please give me some face. Please do not attack the books that other authors have worked so hard to write. This is something I have always cared about. The order of the monthly votes is very interesting and intense competition. It is actually beneficial to one's mental and physical health. Please do not get angry and hurt each other's feelings. That is not good. Please be peaceful, do not be lascivious, and do not hurt. Thank you very much, very much. I don't understand how you can keep holding on. There was no one else in the room in the sword hut. It was very quiet. Fan Xian sat on a chair by the bed and quietly said to the skinny old man on the bed, "You've held on so hard." What? Fan Xian was still somewhat afraid of this great grandmaster. Otherwise, given his sharp nature under his gentle appearance, the words he would have said would have been even harsher. Although Sigurjian was already at the end of his rope, he was still afraid that the skinny old man on the bed would suddenly become a large sword and ruthlessly hack toward him. Sigurjian lay on the bed and looked upward with soulless eyes. Although his breathing was not rushed, it was unusually deep. It sounded like a broken bellow, giving one the feeling that the flame in the furnace was about to go out. This was exactly what Fan Xian did not understand. Sigurjian had clearly been hit by Yi Liuyun's Sanzhou and the Emperor's Way of the Emperor's Punch on Dong Mountain. His life had long been extinguished. He didn't know what method he had used to be able to struggle at death's door for 3 years. However, a month ago, after being stabbed twice by the Shadow's thunderous sword, this great grandmaster finally could not hold on any longer. The zhenqi in his meridians had completely dissipated, and he had become a piece of dead wood on the bed. Fan Xian could clearly sense the pain and price Sigurjian had paid to forcefully extend his life. He didn't understand. Since living was so difficult and the agreement had already been reached, why did Sigurjian continue to use the pure life-saving zhenqi in his body to forcefully drag on? Sigurjian's body was already very skinny. In this month's battle with the Netherworld, he had used up a lot of energy. He had lost nearly 10 kilograms. His entire body's flesh had withered. His skin was almost sticking to his bones. He looked terrifying. The sound of laughter rang out from the bed. In a raspy voice, Sigurjian said in a low voice, "There is no reason for life and death. I don't want to die yet, so I want to live." Fan Xian looked at him calmly. After confirming that he was already paralyzed in all 4 limbs, he couldn't help but sigh. Standing up, he said, "Logically speaking, your disciples have injured me many times in the past. Of the 100 tiger guards you killed on Dong Mountain, many were trusted subordinates whom I wanted to protect. For some reason, seeing you about to die, I don't feel much of the joy of revenge. Because, you know that those tiger guards were killed by your emperor through the sword in my hand." Sigurjian's breathing gradually calmed. His words also gradually became steady. Only his eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, could no longer condense the sword light that had once dominated the world. They were cold and slack. Fan Xian paused for a moment and then respectfully asked for guidance. "I really want to know how you've survived these years." Sigurjian was silent and didn't speak. Fan Xian walked forward and stood by the bed. He gently lifted the blanket and carefully pulled back the soft, light clothing covering the great grandmaster's body. Looking at the large wound on his chest, he didn't speak for a long time. This was a rude and disrespectful action. No one else in the sword hut saw it, but Fan Xian still felt that his action was rude and inappropriate. He only glanced at it before carefully pulling the clothing on Sigurjian's body into place. A great grandmaster on the verge of death could only have Fan Xian look at him like he was examining a corpse. Presumably, Sigurjian should feel angry in his heart. Strangely, Sigurjian's gaze did not change at all. He only looked at the beam above his head. No one knew what he was thinking. Fan Xian sat back in the chair and began to carefully think back to the wound he had seen earlier. The reason he was interested in Sigurjian's wound was because he truly didn't know how this great grandmaster had extended his life by 3 years. He knew that the true cause of Sigurjian's death was the punch the emperor had landed on his body. Even if he was a great grandmaster, the meridians in his abdomen had all shattered, and his organs had all rotted. How could he have survived? In the manner of the master of the city, when the shadow had tried to assassinate Sigurjian, Fan Xian had caught a glimpse of the strange wound on the great grandmaster's abdomen. The wound was suffused with a terrifying green light. This green light was a color Fan Xian was familiar with. It was the color of poison. Fan Xian sat in the chair and was silent for a long time. Suddenly he said, "How long did Sir Fei stay in Dongyi?" Sigurjian smiled with difficulty. A moment later he quietly said, "Actually, you are smarter than you think." Fan Xian sat woodenly in the chair and said, "To use a strong poison to cut off meridians and freeze rotten flesh, This kind of mysterious method of using poison is not something everyone can do. He sighed and gently rubbed his temples. I once heard Sir talk about this kind of realm when I was young, but I never thought that someone could actually do it. Of the 3 great grandmasters who use poison in the world, Xiao En is dead. I know the one in Dongyi was made up by you. Although he had some skill, other than Sir Fei, who else could truly use poison to let you live a few more years? Furthermore, he always told me that he was going out to sea. If he didn't leave from Chuanzhou, he would leave from Dongyi. It was as if Fan Xian was talking to himself. In a quiet voice he said, "He cured you back then. It is not too surprising that he has come to cure you again." Sigu Jian's body was frozen on the bed, unable to move at all. Coldly he said, "Fei Jie stayed in the sword hut for a year and a half and then went out to sea." A sense of confusion suddenly rose in Fan Xian's heart. When he saw Sigu Jian's injuries in the manner of the master of the city, he had already become suspicious. He had thought that Sir Fei Jie was still quietly hiding in the sword hut. He had not thought that he had long left. After he had been reborn into this world, other than his grandmother and Uncle Wu Zhu, his 2 relatives, Sir Fei Jie was the first elder he had met and the first person to wholeheartedly love him. Although he was a strange person, Fan Xian and Fei Jie had not spent much time together. The 2 of them were particularly close. It was a kind of intimacy forged through corpses and poison. Sir Fei Jie had truly gone out to sea. He would probably never return to this land again. Fan Xian's heart suddenly felt cold. A faint sorrow welled up. He thought of how his father, Qin Pingping, and even the emperor might all leave him one by one, leaving him alone in this world. This was a sorrow that was difficult to bear. Fei Jie and Yi Luyun went out to sea together. Sigu Jian revealed another secret. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. After Dong Mountain, Yi Luyun had only recovered from his injuries for 2 months. Then, just like in the past few decades, no one knew of him again. Not even Yi Zhong and Yi Ling'er knew. However, the Qing people were all used to this great grandmaster's carefree life, so no one cared too much. Going out to sea? To a new land? Fan Xian smiled bitterly with difficulty. Everyone left quite straightforwardly. Yi Luyun was stabbed by me on the mountain. It is impossible for him to return to his original level, Sigu Jian said calmly as he lay on the bed. Sigu Jian lay on the bed and spoke calmly. There was not a trace of pride or ruthlessness. Fei Jie followed him out to sea and could take care of his injuries. Yi Luyun's hands could protect Fei Jie. These 2 old things lived quite freely. Fan Xian stood. After a moment of silence, he gazed at him and said, "The negotiations between the Qing kingdom and Dongyi are still continuing. As you know, this matter cannot be settled in a short amount of time. The nobles of the vassal states will certainly still retaliate. You are about to die. You won't be able to control these problems. When the time comes, I may be ruthless. This has nothing to do with me." Sigu Jian's small and thin body was buried under the blankets. He appeared very pitiful. "You're telling me this, cough, cough, are you leaving?" "I need to make a temporary trip back to the capital and then come back to deal with the follow-up matters." Fan Xian nodded and walked toward the door. When his feet suddenly stepped on the doorstep, he suddenly said, "Just what message did Qin Pingping have Fei Jie bring you?" It was like Sigu Jian had fallen asleep and did not reply. Fan Xian turned around at the doorstep. His eyes were full of worry. He continued to ask, "Ku he wants to prolong Qin Pingping's life, and Qin Pingping wants to prolong your life. Why must you old people suffer so much? Sometimes I truly cannot believe that the old director would choose such a path. It is not in line with his sense of beauty. I'm also very surprised." Sigu Jian laughed in a very ugly way. "That old dog has clearly always been loyal to the Qing emperor. Why would he help me protect my life? Is he not afraid that I will slaughter through the hanging temple?" Fan Xian didn't open his mouth to speak. He thought darkly in his heart that the things that the old cripple was thinking of were just using human nature. What a wretched and painful plan this was. 3 years ago, before the Jingdo rebellion, the director was poisoned. Fan Xian suddenly lowered his head and said, "That person was someone from Dongyi." After saying this, he walked out of the room. He walked out of the lifeless room filled with murderous intent. He stood beside the large pit in the middle of the sword hut and raised his head to look at the sky. He was silent for a long time and didn't speak. White clouds floated in the sky. The round and bright sun was at the end of the long clouds. It looked like a burning brush drawing an eye-piercing picture in the blue sky, burning itself to illuminate others. The universe was originally dark, but its eyes could not tolerate any darkness. It furiously burned the fuel from the beginning of time, wanting to illuminate all of the darkness hidden behind the stars. Fan Xian stood beside the sword pit and took a deep breath. The two circulations in his body slowly moved. Tianyi Dao's Jinqi protected his heart and meridians. He raised his tyrannical true method to the highest realm. The Jinqi in his body was abundant. It surged until his clothes flapped loudly in the windless environment. A seemingly endless stream of Jinqi flowed along his arms and into his steady palms, slowly being released. This was a method of circulating Jinqi. Not everyone knew it. It was a useless method Fan Xian had thought of to climb the cliff. However, he had practiced it for 20 years and was very familiar with it. The Jinqi was released and moved according to his will. It was very natural. It was an interesting idea. Who would have thought that many years later, it would have such an effect? Fan Xian stood beside the sword grave with his arms spread out in both directions. The countless swords in the pit began to jingle. It was as if they felt the call of this Jinqi and began to tremble endlessly. A simple sword was the first to be unable to withstand this kind of power. The tip of the sword cried out sorrowfully and broke free of the yellow earth at the bottom of the pit. The scrap of paper and trash that Sigu Jian had thrown in flew up and into Fan Xian's hand. Fan Xian looked calmly at the sword in his hand and compared it to the sword of the Wei Emperor he often used. He found that it was indeed not eye-catching at all. He couldn't help but laugh bitterly and say, "It's also fate." On the bed in the darkness of the room, the dying great-grandmaster Sigu Jian smiled and said to himself, "It's still not enough." Fan Xian looked at the sword in his hand and sighed. It's still far from enough. In the darkness of the night, 3 carriages headed west as fast as they could. The group of carriages carried the honored guests of the Qin kingdom. Under the current situation, no one dared to stop these carriages for inspection within the territory controlled by Dongyi. Thus the group of carriages moved quickly. Furthermore, the color of these carriages was black. Mu Feng carefully poured a basin of hot water and placed it in front of the commissioner. He was terrified that as the carriages moved forward, he would spill the water. Fan Xian's daily life could be considered luxurious. He didn't know where these Overwatch Council officials obtained hot water. He scooped up a scalding towel from the basin and forcefully wiped his tired face. "Is there any news from Jingdo?" "Everything is as usual," Mu Feng replied quietly as he glanced at him. He didn't know why the commissioner was in such a rush to return to the capital. Although the negotiations with Dongyi were troublesome and he needed to return to the capital to hand the details of the negotiations to the emperor to decide, why did he have to make the time so tight? He even had to take the risk of traveling at night. Fortunately, there were no mountain roads near Dongyi. Otherwise, if the carriages flipped, no one would be able to bear the responsibility. The emperor would probably execute all of the Overwatch Council officials accompanying him. Hearing Mu Feng's reply, Fan Xian's mood relaxed greatly. It was now the 10th year of the Qin calendar. It had been 5 or 6 years since he had officially entered the Overwatch Council. More accurately speaking, from the day he was born, he had been raised by Qin Pingping in preparation to take over the Overwatch Council. At the age of 5, other than learning poisons from Sir Fei Jie, he had spent most of his time studying the Overwatch Council's regulations and organizational planning. Now, Fan Xian had firmly grasped the terrifying organization that was the Overwatch Council. He had his own judgment of his subordinates' loyalty and abilities. The black carriage moved forward silently in the dark night. Although the oil lamp in the carriage was windproof and shockproof, the light still flickered. Fan Xian rubbed his tired eyes and raised them. Suddenly he calmly said, "Xiaofeng, you are Mu Tai's distant nephew, right?" Mu Feng paused. He thought that Sir had long known of this matter, but he still replied respectfully, "He is my uncle, but there has never been a third generation. If someone wanted to kill Mu Tai, what would you do?" Mu Feng jumped in fright and stared at Fan Xian in a daze. For a moment he couldn't say anything. Fan Xian smiled and said, "I'm just giving an example. How about this, if Mu Tai and I had a grudge and he wanted to use his death to incite your hatred toward me, would you kill me because of this?" Mu Feng repeatedly shook his head and didn't say a word. Fan Xian shook his head in boredom and sighed. He then lowered his head again, thinking, how could there be such a stubborn person in this world? As Fan Xian moved forward through the night and returned to Jingdo to explain the Dongyi matter in detail to the emperor, the northern Qi emperor had already returned to the quiet Shangjing. The intersecting black and green eaves of the palace were still as beautiful as ever. Although she had left the royal palace for a while, with the Empress Dowager's powerful suppression and the cooperation of trusted officials in court, no one had discovered anything unusual. In comparison, the northern Qi royal family, which had long been thought by the Qing court to be at odds with mother and son, was actually as united as a metal plate. They knew much more clearly than the Qing kingdom. The northern Qi emperor stared in a daze at the dark night outside the palace. She turned her head to glance at the beautiful woman reading a book behind her. Suddenly she asked, "You and Fan Xian were only in the room for an hour. Was he in such a rush? Or were you in the throes of love and unable to control yourself?" After returning to the palace, although the little emperor's favor toward imperial consort Li had not decreased, the sharpness in her words could not be stopped. See, Lily had grown up with her, so of course she knew what kind of person she was. She had endured for half a month without explaining, but today she smiled and said, "Your Majesty, I know you are jealous. There is no need to show it so obviously." When Fan Xian had said those words, the little emperor's expression had become ugly. After hearing Si Lily's words, she couldn't help but huff coldly. Si Lily stood up, walked behind her, and rested her cheek on her thin shoulder. She wrapped her arms around her and gently caressed her belly. Her breath smelled like orchids. Fan Xian's words are simple. If you're pregnant, then of course I'm the only one who's pregnant. No matter which one of us is pregnant, we have to tell him as a father. The little emperor fell silent and suddenly said, "I wonder if that pretty boy is having a good time in Dongyi." Si Lily didn't reply. She only thought that Sir Fan Jr. was the most dashing man in the world, but he had caused so much trouble. He was probably caught in the middle and would become the most troubled man in the world. The most troubled man in the world finally returned to Jingdo with great difficulty. The black carriage quickly passed through the double checks of the Jingdo garrison and 13 city gate guards and came to the gates of the royal palace. Chapter 649. 3 years ago, there had been chaos in the palace in Jingdo. A large number of the masters in the palace had died, but the relationships in the palace had become simpler. The overall atmosphere had become much more solemn and direct. The empress had died. It looked like the emperor had no intention of making a new empress. The empress dowager had died. There was no longer an old woman sitting high up and watching over the concubines. Lady Shu had indifferently accepted the result of her son's death. She only ate vegetarian food in the cold and cheerless palace. The emperor not banishing her into the cold palace could already be considered exceptionally merciful. In the palace, the women with the most power to speak were the third prince's mother, Yi Gui-pin, and the great prince's mother, Lady Ning. These two concubines had both been injured in the palace rebellion. They had formed a blood-stained friendship in the battle. They worked together to handle matters in the palace and could be considered very harmonious. As for the matter of passing on the throne, which could affect the atmosphere in the rear palace, it could not cause any major problems at the moment. Although the emperor had not chosen another crown prince, everyone knew that the prince most likely to take over the Qing kingdom was the third prince, Li Qingping. Although the third prince was still young, only a 13 or 14-year-old youth, the only two elder brothers who could threaten his position were the great prince. Everyone knew that the great prince did not have the slightest intention of coveting the throne. Furthermore, he had the blood of a Dongyi female slave girl in his body. This made it naturally difficult for him to inherit the throne. There was also a potential competitor, which was Fan Xian. However, Sir Fan Jr. was, after all, an illegitimate child. Furthermore, he was the third prince's teacher. Most importantly, looking at what had happened these years, Sir Fan Jr. had no interest in that throne at all. As for whether or not Fan Xian had any interest in the eyes of the officials and concubines in the palace, that was a question worth pondering. At least for now, the third prince's path was bright. The support at his side was real. The path of the entire Qing kingdom was clear. Thus, the atmosphere in the royal palace was good. Small, united meetings were held every day. Everyone's spirits were filled with a sense of striving to improve. Fan Xian traveled the entire way. By the time he returned to Jingdo, it was already dusk. After he entered the depths of the palace, the entire sky had darkened. He sat in the imperial study and rubbed his slightly bulging stomach. He couldn't help but frown, thinking that he should have gone to Xinfeng restaurant to get some buns before entering the palace. This was just a wonderful idea. He had the emperor's heavy responsibility. Since he was returning to the capital to report, how could he dare to linger outside the palace? Just as he was feeling annoyed, he suddenly saw two young eunuchs carrying a meal box into the imperial study. No one knew where the emperor was eating dinner in the palace. Even if the internal court notified him that Fan Xian had returned to the capital, he would not be able to rush over. Fan Xian looked in a daze at the food in the box. He smiled and said, "You know I haven't eaten?" Eunuch Yao usually followed at the emperor's side. The head of the eunuchs on duty outside the royal study was also someone Fan Xian was familiar with. It was Eunuch Dai, who had performed a great service in the palace coup. Eunuch Dai looked at Fan Xian with a wide smile and said, "You are anxious about state affairs. Presumably you have missed your meal. Pick some refreshments first. The emperor is eating in the back palace at this time. Even if I wanted to reward you with a bowl of fish roe rice, I'm afraid it would be too late." Fan Xian did not stand on ceremony. He began to attack the food in the box. As an official, sitting in the royal study when the emperor was not present was a crime punishable by execution. To eat in the royal study without asking for an edict was even more disrespectful. However, he had long received a special edict, so he sat calmly and ate without worry. To the side, Eunuch Dai smiled and thought in the end Sir Fan Jr. was not a normal official. Immediately after, he thought of the matter that had been spreading around the world recently. Eunuch Dai's heart heated up again. Sir Fan Jr. had performed a great service for the Qing kingdom. He didn't know how the emperor would reward him. The reason this head of eunuchs felt hot was because he knew that most of his future was in the emperor's hands. The other half was completely connected to Sir Fan Jr. His life in the palace had always been smooth sailing. It was not until Fan Xian appeared that he began to suffer misfortune and rise again. Because he had contributed greatly during the Jingdo rebellion, he was now the deputy head eunuch. His status was even more noble than when he had been in Lady Shu's palace. Occasionally, Eunuch Dai would think with lingering fear that if he had continued to be on duty in Lady Shu's palace, he would probably already be a member of the Cold Palace or even long dead. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but glance behind him out of the corner of his eye. The eunuch following him had once been a popular figure in the royal study. It was a pity that he later served his master in the Eastern Palace. Although he hadn't done anything wrong, his status had already plummeted. Fan Xian put down his chopsticks and said a few warm words to Eunuch Dai. Only then did he slowly turn his gaze behind him. He looked at the increasingly steady young eunuch, whose acne was still clear on his face. Calmly he said, "You still haven't died." "That is somewhat unexpected." Hongzhu's face was full of respect. He bowed toward Fan Xian and replied, "I have received the emperor's favor and came out of the Cold Palace at the end of the year. In the future, remember to serve the emperor more attentively." Fan Xian said these words without much emotion and then closed his mouth. Eunuch Dai could see that his mood was not very good. He casually said a few words of flattery and then led Hongzhu out of the royal study. He thought to himself that there had always been rumors in the palace that Eunuch Hong and Sir Fan Jr. did not see eye to eye. Back then it was Sir Fan Jr. who had kicked this kid to the Eastern Palace. Looking at it now, it was indeed so. He couldn't help but laugh coldly 3 times in his heart. He thought to himself that even with old Eunuch Hong watching over Hongzhu, he was still no match for the little duke's hand that reached in from outside the palace. Now that Eunuch Hong was dead, Hongzhu's position in the palace was very awkward. Eunuch Dai completely did not notice that when he left the royal study, Fan Xian and Hongzhu met each other's eyes. There was mutual concern in their eyes. Then they gently and imperceptibly nodded their heads. It was completely silent in the royal study. Fan Xian silently sorted through the thoughts in his mind. It was expected that Hongzhu would come out of the Cold Palace. This kid had always been well liked by the nobles in the palace. In the rebellion, it appeared that Hongzhu had no knowledge of it. It was expected that he would be used. Of course, in this matter, Fan Xian had gone around many twists and turns and helped Hongzhu put in some effort. As for the entanglement of the 3 years, Fan Xian had already stopped thinking about it. At least, this little eunuch had helped him too much. In terms of affection, it was he who owed him and not the other way around. Just as he was thinking this, a wave of hurried footsteps came from outside the royal study. The faint light of a lantern came from the other side of the glass window, illuminating the night and floating toward them. Fan Xian quickly pulled back his stretched arms and stood to welcome the emperor. The door to the royal study was pushed open. The Qing emperor, dressed in a bright yellow robe, walked in with large steps. His slightly thin face was calm. Only the white hair at his temples revealed his true age and how much energy he had expended these years. The group of serving eunuchs did not enter. Cleverly, Eunuch Yao closed the royal study's door tightly from behind. Only the emperor and Fan Xian were left in the royal study. The emperor sat comfortably on the soft couch and rubbed his knees with both hands. Looking at Fan Xian, he suddenly laughed out loud. Fan Xian was confused by this string of laughter and stood awkwardly where he was. The emperor shook his head and said, "You're very good." Since he was very good, why did he shake his head? Fan Xian laughed bitterly and took out the box of secret memorials that the council had prepared and placed it on the low table in the middle of the soft couch. The emperor opened the box and began to read it carefully. Inside the box were the preliminary results of the negotiations between the Qin Kingdom and Dongyi, as well as the Overwatch Council's analysis of Dongyi's bottom line, the territory map that Dongyi had presented, and the detailed situation of the distribution of people and finances. The Dongyi matter had long shocked the entire world. The diplomatic group responsible for the negotiations, including Fan Xian himself, maintained a daily exchange of the details of the negotiations with the royal palace in Jingdo. The emperor knew the details of the negotiations very well. After all, the two places were very far apart. If he wanted to truly grasp the first-hand situation, he would need Fan Xian to return to the capital and make a face-to-face report. The emperor slowly put down the file in his hands and stood. Walking to one of the walls of the royal study, he pulled open the curtain hanging on the wall. Below the curtain was a large map of the world. On it was clearly drawn the roads of each province. Even the coastlines to the east and south were drawn in great detail. This map not only included the territory of the Qin Kingdom but also the territory of northern Qi and Dongyi. The first time Fan Xian had truly entered the royal study to discuss matters, he had sat with the ministers and scholars. He had seen this map and knew of the boundless passion the Qing monarch and officials had for expanding their borders. At that time, there had been 3 princes at the emperor's side. Now 2 of them were gone. The emperor's steady palm moved across the map. Although the light in the royal study was bright, it was not the shadowless light in an operating room. Wherever his palm moved on the map, there was a patch of darkness. It was like a black arrow containing boundless authority, representing hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and full of murderous intent. The palm landed above Dongyi and the surrounding vassal states and gently patted them. The emperor did not turn his head. Calmly he said, "Without using a single soldier, I have this place. Fan Xian, how do you think I should reward you? The negotiations have not ended. There are still internal disputes in the Sword Hut. The nobles of the vassal states will probably still rebel. Most importantly, I don't know if it will cause a backlash from Dongyi in the future," Fan Xian replied with a smile. He could see that although the emperor's expression was calm, the joy in the depths of his heart could not be hidden. This emperor, who wholeheartedly wanted to unify the world and establish a legacy that would last for thousands of generations, had spent decades to finally eliminate Ku He and Sigu Jian, his 2 greatest opponents. He had taken the first step on a journey of tens of thousands of li. That kind of joy could not be faked. "How is Sigu Jian?" The emperor turned and smiled. He did not continue to raise the question of rewards. Instead, he asked about the matter he cared about the most. "His entire body is paralyzed. He will die within 3 months without a doubt," Fan Xian answered quickly and without any hesitation. The emperor thought for a moment and then sighed quietly. "He's going to die. However, I truly admire this sword fanatic. He took a blow from Uncle Lu Yun and a punch from me, yet he was still able to live for so long. The strength of this person's physical body is indeed the strongest of us." Naturally, these words excluded Wu Zhu. Fan Xian's eyes moved slightly. In a quiet voice he said, "It is also fortunate that Sigu Jian did not die. Only he can suppress the warriors in the Sword Hut. If he had not nodded his head, this negotiation would probably not have succeeded." The emperor smiled and didn't say anything. He still did not understand his son. Were these words putting in a good word for Sigu Jian? What was the point in putting in a good word for a great grandmaster who was about to die? Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said, "In my opinion, this negotiation will probably last until next year. At that time, Sigu Jian will have long died. However, since he has set the tone and spread it everywhere, presumably, the disciples of the Sword Hut will not dare to disobey." "Will 13th Wang take over as the master of the Sword Hut?" the emperor suddenly asked. For this emperor, he did not care at all about Fan Xian and 13th Wang's personal relationship. What he cared about was that, in order to truly control the territory of Dongyi, the master of the Sword Hut had to be someone he could control. The young disciple of the Sword Hut, 13th Wang, had deep ties with the Qin Kingdom. Regardless of his abilities, he had to be someone he could control. Fan Xian's heart tightened. His mind spun quickly. The opening ceremony has been delayed by a month. No one has said anything. However, I have not found out who Sigu Jian is planning to give the Sword Hut to. There is no need to find out. The emperor's expression darkened. If Dongyi is truly willing to submit, the master of the Sword Hut must be appointed by me. Regardless of who Sigu Jian chooses, if I don't nod my head and seal, then it cannot be done. Fan Xian's lips tasted bitter. He had been worried that Sigurjien would forcefully reveal the Shadow's identity and have him become the second master of the Sword Hut. Now, it looked like he should be worried about something else. The Emperor's actions were very similar to how he had appointed the head of the Lamas. Thinking about it closely, it made sense. Even if the Qing kingdom sent officials and soldiers to Dongyi in the future, in the hearts of the Dongyi people, the true masters were still the disciples of the Sword Hut. This should be clearly written in the agreement between the two countries. The Qing kingdom would not make any major changes to the structure of Dongyi within 50 years. If the Qing kingdom didn't even have the power to appoint and dismiss people in name, how could Dongyi count as submitting? I will make this clear to them after I return to Dongyi. Fan Xian didn't think further and agreed straightforwardly. As long as the Sword Hut lowers its head, there is no need to consider the businesses of the other small countries, the Emperor said with narrowed eyes. The Emperor narrowed his eyes and said, if Sigurjien was smart enough, he wouldn't do anything before he died. If he was truly an idiot, I would give him a profound lesson. When the Emperor was angry, blood flowed under heaven. The lesson the Qing Emperor spoke of was to brazenly send out troops and forcefully conquer Dongyi. Fan Xian didn't continue this topic. Straightforwardly he asked, if the Sword Hut is decided, what about the manor of the master of the city? Weren't the people in the manor of the master of the city killed by Sigurjien? The Emperor stood by the map and suddenly looked deeply at Fan Xian. Actually, it isn't just me who is curious. Other than feeling great joy, all of the officials in court are also shocked. And Sigurjien, that old thing, had a special liking for you. Who would have thought that he would actually be able to suppress his wild nature and agree to your request? Before he left for Dongyi, Fan Xian and the Emperor had argued for a long time in the palace. In the Emperor's opinion, even if Sigurjien died, he would not allow Dongyi, which he had guarded for so many years, to surrender to the Qing kingdom without sending out a single soldier or firing an arrow. Fan Xian insisted on his own opinion and used a long time to convince the Qing Emperor to let him try. The problem was he had succeeded on the first try. This reality surprised all the officials in the Qing court. It also made the Emperor very happy and even faintly uneasy. His illegitimate child had truly given the world too many surprises. There was doubt and suspicion in the Emperor's gaze, but Fan Xian seemed to not feel anything. He smiled bitterly and straightforwardly said, I don't dare to claim credit. If it weren't for the fact that the Qing kingdom is strong and powerful, Dongyi would only have two paths after Sigurjien's death. They would not have lowered their heads and submitted to the Qing kingdom. These words were true. Any diplomatic negotiation was rooted in the foundation of power. Perhaps Northern Qi had the power to contend with the Qing kingdom for many years. However, Dongyi was established as a merchant and was not at all firm. It was like duckweed in the water or a light cloud in the sky. As long as a strong wind blew, it would scatter like duckweed. Under the pressure of the Qing kingdom's powerful national and military power, Dongyi didn't have much of a choice. Fan Xian's success this time was actually the Qing Emperor's success. Under his rule was a particularly powerful kingdom. Fan Xian suddenly took a deep breath and said, as you know, my mother came from Dongyi. Sigurjien has some feelings for me. He knew he couldn't hide this from the Emperor. He didn't want to hide it, so he might as well say it directly. As expected, the Emperor clearly knew about Yi Qingmei's past in Dongyi. After hearing these words, he only smiled slightly and said, as expected. What request does Sigurjien have for you? Fan Xian raised his head and said seriously, he hopes that the Dongyi under the Qing kingdom's rule will still be the Dongyi of today. I allow it. The Emperor waved his hand decisively. Without waiting for Fan Xian to say anything, he straightforwardly said, the Dongyi I want is the present Dongyi. It has become like Jiangnan. What do I want it for? Fan Xian was incomparably shocked. The problem he and Sigurjien were most worried about was not a problem at all in the Emperor's heart. What the Emperor wanted was the present Dongyi, a Dongyi with a faint sense of self-rule by merchants that carried out large trade deals with overseas. Thinking of this, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel boundless admiration for the Emperor. Only an emperor with great foresight could tolerate such a situation. The Emperor's will and vision were probably broader than he had imagined. Immediately after, the Emperor and Fan Xian discussed the details of bringing Dongyi into the territory, as well as the problems that could appear and related countermeasures. It was gradually getting late, but the lights in the royal study remained bright. The map of the world gradually changed as the father and son discussed it. After a long time, the Emperor rubbed his tired eyes and turned his head back to look at the map again. The map of the world had already changed, but this map had not. The Emperor quietly said, I'll be making a new map tomorrow. "Congratulations, Your Majesty," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. At this moment the emperor finally smiled. His palm suddenly slapped heavily on the top of the map. It was a large piece of foreign territory that had been painted green. The bright yellow clothes seemed to carry an unstoppable sense of determination. "There is only this piece left in the world." Fan Xian's heart suddenly tightened. The emperor raised the question from earlier for the second time. "And Ji, how do you think I should reward you?" In history there were many examples of people who had done too much to shock the ruler and died a horrible death. When these examples were unlucky, it was often because of this sentence. Because their contributions were too great and they had already received too many rewards, there was no reward to be given. It was impossible for the person on the throne to give half of the throne to these examples. Thus, without exception, the examples all ran down the road to death. Occasionally, there were examples who jumped out and successfully rebelled, but they were in the minority. Hearing this question, Fan Xian did not feel any fear at all. He only pulled a long face and sank into thought. His contributions this time were not great. Based on what he had said earlier, Dongyi's submission was ultimately because of the Qin kingdom's strength. He was just a primer, an excuse Sigurjian used to convince himself. As for his contributions being too great to shock the ruler, forget it. The emperor's self-confidence and narcissism were the first in 1,000 years. In his life, he had never worried about which official or son would be able to surpass him. A powerful emperor would have a strong tolerance towards the people under the dragon throne. However, Fan Xian did indeed have the third problem of the examples. It was the problem of having no reward to give. He was already a first-rate duke and sat in the two great treasuries of the Palace Treasury and Overwatch Council. The power in his hands was 1/3 of the world. What more could the emperor reward him with? Was it really as the people in the diplomatic group secretly guessed that he would be made a king? However, he had to ask for a reward. The entire world was watching Jingdo. If Fan Xian performed the greatest service but didn't have a reward he could take out, the officials would probably all feel bitterly disappointed in the emperor. After a long time, Fan Xian suddenly smiled bitterly. Looking at the emperor by the map, he scratched his head and said self-mockingly, "How about you give Dongyi to me?" Of course this was a joke, a huge joke. At most, being made a king would be an idle prince of Dongba. If he actually gave Dongyi away, it would be splitting the land and making him a marquis. The emperor also smiled. However, his smile was not as amusing as Fan Xian had imagined. On the contrary, it carried an indescribable sense of mockery. "It looks like Sigurjian is truly as he said on Dong Mountain. He wholeheartedly wants you to be the master of the city." Fan Xian's heart chilled. He smiled bitterly and replied, "In any case, the master of the city doesn't care. Let's change it." The emperor couldn't be bothered to continue his conversation. He sat down and picked up a cup of warm tea to slowly sip. Fan Xian stood in front of the emperor and had a headache for a long time. Probingly he said, "But someone has to be sent to manage Dongyi. How about we have a prince be the master of the city?" In the present Qin kingdom there was only one prince, the great prince. He had Dongyi blood running through his veins and a noble status. Furthermore, if they wanted to subdue the hearts of the Dongyi soldiers and civilians, it would be an excellent move for the great prince to be the master of Dongyi. "We will discuss this matter in the future." The emperor furrowed his brows. It was clear he was moved by Fan Xian's suggestion, but more than that he was worried. "I won't enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs," Fan Xian suddenly muttered. "Staying with those old men every day is so boring." The emperor smiled and said, "Sir, he is also in the Hall of Governmental Affairs, isn't he? He is also a young man." These words were just words. The emperor would not allow Fan Xian to give up the power of the Overwatch Council and enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs, destroying his plans for the future of the Qin kingdom. Hearing the emperor's words, the face of the hateful official who watched over Ruorwo every day outside the Dongbua medical shop immediately rose in front of Fan Xian's eyes. He laughed coldly and said, "If your majesty truly wishes to reward me with something, I would like to ask you to grant me 2 edicts." Concerning the matter of the appointed marriage, Fan Xian and the emperor had been in a cold war for over half a year. The moment Fan Xian opened his mouth, the emperor knew what he wanted to say. He thought to himself, "How dare you use your achievements to ask for favors?" His expression became ugly. "1 edict for Ruorwo and 1 for Rojia," Fan Xian said in a low voice. "Please allow them to choose their own husbands." The emperor looked at him coldly. A moment later he suddenly said, "In the matter of Rojia, I will allow you. But I will not allow your sister's marriage." Fan Xian pretended to be angry but his heart was calm. He knew that the emperor would never relent on this matter because the other party wanted to use this matter to completely suppress him. Unless he relented and used the relationship between father and son and the will of a ruler and official to plead with the other party would certainly not let it go. This was a fit of pique, but it was not just a fit of pique. The emperor wanted to completely control Fan Xian and have him completely lower his head in front of him. The emperor had always clearly felt that his son was different from other sons. He had too many traces of his mother. On the surface, his dead sons were incomparably respectful to him, but in secret, they were thinking of things that were lower than pigs and dogs. And Ji, on the other hand, had a glimmer of unwillingness to be honest seeping out of his bones. Although the emperor admired Fan Xian's absolute sincerity, he wanted to beat this sincerity into absolute loyalty. There is no need to speak of this matter again. The emperor stared at Fan Xian with a cold expression. He suddenly thought of something and smiled slightly. Just one edict from Rojia is to reward you for today's work. It is indeed somewhat unreasonable. However, I remember that you are still only the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew the meat of the show had come, but his face was one of confusion. In any case, that old dog Qin Pingping doesn't care. You can directly take over the position of director and let that old man have a good rest. The emperor looked at him with slight mockery and said, "In your early 20s, I have given you the position of director of the Overwatch Council. It can be considered a great kindness. Why don't you quickly give your thanks?" Fan Xian was indeed still only the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. After all these years, under Qin Pingping's purposeful nurturing and delegating of power, he had long grasped the entire Overwatch Council. What difference was there between him and the director? Yet, the emperor was using such a natural and expected promotion to dismiss the merit he had made in Dongyi and block his thoughts of breaking off the marriage. It was truly ungrateful. The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched. It was as if he was angry and wanted to say something disrespectful. In the end, he suppressed his emotions and gave a random bow, gave his thanks and left the palace. The emperor smiled in the royal study and did not take offense to his son's rudeness. That night, Fan Xian returned to his manor. He did not immediately go to do the second thing. Through the conversation in the royal study, his mood had already relaxed. At least, the seemingly omnipotent emperor could not grasp the minute movements of the entire world. Furthermore, in the battle of tempers and personalities, he had won another battle. Sitting by the side of the bed, he soaked his feet in the scalding hot water to relieve some of his tiredness. Lin Wanner's face was full of tiredness. She leaned against his shoulder and said, "You didn't even tell us you were coming back. The house was not prepared at all. The servants are all asleep and you won't wake them up. I'll rest for a few days. I still have to go to Dongyi to take charge." Fan Xian gently held his wife's hand and smiled. "I'm too busy. You also don't know who gave you this name." Lin Wanner yawned. She was clearly a woman who had given birth, yet her face still carried a childishness that was difficult to wash away. Particularly her round cheeks. It amused Fan Xian greatly. He gently pinched his wife's cheek and smiled. "Other than that person who would have such a tasteless name. Why are you in such a good mood today?" Lin Wanner suddenly made a sound. Fan Xian proudly said, "Today I asked for a good official. Tomorrow I will leave the city and go into the garden to chase people away. Did anyone see the happy headquarters yesterday? Tell me, isn't it normal for a middle-aged vulgar man to like Lin Chen? Ha 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 ha, one of my greatest wishes is to personally pinch the flesh on Lin Chen's cheeks." Chapter 650. The large bed in the back of the Fan Manor was still soft. The pair of children were usually treated like little ancestors. At this moment, they were sleeping peacefully under the careful care of the nannies. No one would disturb the people in the main room. Fan Xian was indeed sleepy. He only said a few words to Wan before he sank into the land of dreams. His feet were even soaked in hot water. Lin Wanner sighed and rose to put on an unlined robe. She began to continue her work. Jingdo was peaceful in the night. Most people had already entered He Tian's hometown. Only the emperor, who was unusually diligent, was still reading through the memorials sent from the 7 roads and provinces. Although these memorials had already been read twice by the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the emperor was used to scrutinizing everything under the heavens, so his workload was still great. The light in the royal study did not tremble at all, but the door began to tremble. Eunuch Yao led another plain-looking eunuch into the royal study without asking for permission. The emperor raised his head and glanced at the two of them. He furrowed his brows and said, "What did you find?" Eunuch Hong had died on Dong Mountain. Eunuch Ho had died during the Jingdo attack on the palace. The internal court eunuchs were all under Eunuch Yao's control. Although the power of the internal court was not great, because of its special position, its power could not be underestimated. Other than the defense of the palace, the most important responsibility of this department was the bridge through which the emperor secretly controlled the Overwatch Council. This was the Internal Affairs Bureau that had given the Overwatch Council headaches in the past. However, because of Qin Pingping's existence, the internal court appeared rather humble in the eyes of the Overwatch Council and could not be of much use. Later, the emperor had the Imperial Censorate begin to compete with the Overwatch Council. Thus, many people began to forget that the internal court had such a function. Eunuch Yao didn't say anything. He accepted the 2 files from the plain-looking eunuch's hands and placed them on the table in front of the emperor. The files were thin. There was certainly not much content inside. The emperor scanned them lightly. His expression changed slightly before immediately returning to normal. But it was this slight change that caused Eunuch Yao's heart to sink into ice. The emperor's expression did not change even when the eastern mountain collapsed in front of him. Under the siege of 2 great grandmasters, he still talked and laughed without fear. Yet because of this thin piece of paper he was moved. It could be imagined that the content inside had a great impact on the emperor's mind. The contents of the paper had nothing to do with the assassination in the floating temple. Even if it was related, it was only the later part. What the internal court had been investigating these 2 years was the whereabouts of the city-guarding crossbows produced by the palace treasury's 3rd workshop that winter. Those city-guarding crossbows in the valley on the outskirts of Jingdo had almost caused Fan Xian to die a tragic death. Later, the emperor and Fan Xian both found out that the attack was done by the Qin family, but these city-guarding crossbows were numbered in the name of the Dingzhou army. The emperor withdrew his gaze from the file and was silent for a long time without saying a word. It was as if he also did not understand this matter. That day, Fan Xian had been assassinated in the outskirts of Jingdo. As a ruler and a father, it was difficult for him to suppress his anger. No matter how he investigated, he could not find anything specific. It was not until today, after the internal court's painstaking investigation, that they discovered that there was a shadow in a wheelchair behind the matter. Other than being shocked, the emperor did not understand. Even someone like him could not understand why that old dog would do such a thing. Furthermore, it was clear that Nji did not know of this matter. Otherwise, he would not have gone through so many twists and turns to find a glorious and comfortable path of retreat for that old dog. The emperor rubbed his slightly tense brows and coughed gently. Picking up another file, he glanced at it and asked, "Did that person from Northern Qi also go to Dongyi?" "Yes." The plain-looking internal court investigator said respectfully, "The Duke of Danbo kidnapped the Northern Qi emperor into his hut. Afterward they met privately by the seaside. As for what exactly they talked about, we were unable to find out." Fan Xian had not reported this matter to the emperor. The emperor looked at the paper and Fan Xian's every move in Dongyi recorded on it. His brows became slightly dark. A moment later he said, "What else?" The knives that appeared in Qingzhou were indeed produced by the 3rd workshop of the palace treasury, but they were trial models. They had not yet been distributed to the military, so they could not have come from the military. The plain-looking eunuch continued, 3 of those knives appeared. In the end we only obtained 1. Following the emperor's orders, we sent this knife to Sir Fan Jr. to give him a reminder. Looking at it later, it should have been the person on the grasslands who took the other 2 knives. It looked like he was helping the Duke of Danbo hide something. Xia Mingji and the 2nd young master of the Fan family's cross-border goods have long been watched. They are all daily necessities. These knives shouldn't have come from this channel. Although Eunuch Yao was the head eunuch of the internal court in name, in reality, the internal court's investigations were directly answered to the emperor. Thus, this was the first time he had heard of this seemingly vague but, in reality, shocking news. His face was slightly pale. He knew that if the emperor truly believed the internal court's investigation report, Sir Fan Jr. would probably be in big trouble. The old man in the wheelchair would also not have many good days ahead of him. Contrary to Eunuch Yao's expectations, the emperor smiled coldly. "You want to sow discord between the Qin kingdom and Nji with just 3 knives?" After these words were said, Eunuch Yao and the plain-looking eunuch quietly met each other's eyes. They both saw the fear in each other's hearts. Everyone in the world knew that Sir Fan Jr. was the emperor's illegitimate child, but no one in the world could say this truth in front of the emperor. Yet, the emperor had brought this matter to light in front of these 2 eunuchs. "That little guy in Shangjing is very interesting." The emperor smiled slightly. Using a little bit of Nji's kindness, he actually thought of such a thing. The eunuch swallowed and carefully said, "Your Majesty, should we continue investigating?" "Continue investigating the matter of the attack in the valley. The matter of the hanging temple can also be investigated." The emperor closed his eyes tiredly. "Don't investigate Nji's side. In the future, if anything leads to him, let it go." "Yes, Your Majesty." The emperor closed his eyes and was silent for a long time. He didn't understand what role Chen Pingping had played behind his back. Suddenly his heart jumped. He thought that perhaps Fan Xian's son knew about the role Chen Pingping played, which was why he was in such a hurry to take power by disguise. He believed in Fan Xian's loyalty just like everyone else in the world. From the perspectives of profit, morality, and nature, Fan Xian would not betray him. The emperor had this confidence. Even if one day his son learned of the story from many years ago at most, he would only unleash a sorrowful anger at him and would not betray this country. The next day there was rain in Jingdo. Fan Xian wore a black robe and walked through the rain. Behind him were the 3 members of the Qinian unit and a group of 6 bureau swordsmen. Silently they entered a small alley. After exiting the alley, they circled around and saw the narrow door of the manor. Every time he came to the Yen manor, it seemed to be raining. Perhaps the heavens also knew that the father and son living in this manor were some of the most powerful spies in the world. In the style of darkness and light, they maintained a distance from secular society. He felt some sympathy for them. Jingqingzi Manor was still Jingqingzi Manor. So many years had passed, but the Yen Manor was still so low-key. The emperor's rewards and the court's favor were all not displayed on the surface. Fan Xian took off his wet raincoat at the door. Without waiting for an announcement, he walked directly toward the rear courtyard. Before long, he saw the large fake mountain that blocked his view of the rear courtyard. The first time he had entered the Yen Manor, Fan Xian had noticed this large fake mountain. Although the building did pay attention to the pattern of covering the door and concealing the view, this fake mountain was too big, too fake, too abrupt, and too ugly. It was a 10-day break. Usually, Sir Yen Jr., who was always busy, had a rare moment of leisure. He was playing checkers with his wife. He and Lady Xin had been married for some time, but there was still no news from her stomach. However, Yen Bingyun was not worried. Looking at the situation, the entire Yen Manor was not worried. Seeing Fan Xian's arrival, a glimmer of surprise flashed across Yen Bingyun's face. He knew that Fan Xian had returned to the capital last night, but he had always thought that given the commissioner's laziness, he would either be playing Spring Sleepy in his room or going to Prince Heching's manor to compete in drinking with the great prince. He had not thought that he would come to his manor. When Sir Yen Jr. was young in Jingdo and later in Shangjing in disguise, he was a famous scholar. He was skilled in the 4 arts. However, in front of Fan Xian he did not want to display any of his talent or interest. He was like a block of ice, strictly maintaining the division of superiors and subordinates. It was very boring. Thus, Fan Xian did not want to engage in recreational activities outside of official business with him. Every time Fan Xian entered the Yen Manor, it meant that something big was about to happen in the Overwatch Council. "I'm in a good mood today," Fan Xian said with a smile. Lady Shen curtsied hastily toward her husband's immediate superior and returned to the rear courtyard. Shen Zhong's daughter had always had the identity of a female fugitive from northern Qi. A few years ago, she had lived in the Fan Manor for a long time and had a good relationship with the women in the Fan Manor. In front of Fan Xian she always felt complicated emotions. Naturally, she did not know how to get along. Although no one had ever said anything, Lady Shen knew that her father's death and the destruction of her family was not only because of the northern Qi royal family's indulgence and Shang Shanhu's murderous intent. It also had a lot to do with the young leader of the Qing Overwatch Council. Watching the woman's figure disappear into the room, Fan Xian's mood sank. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "How is the matter I talked to you about last time? If you want, I can help her get rid of her identity as a fugitive from northern Qi." Yen Bingyun stood up and stood in the corridor as if looking at the rain and thinking. A moment later, he said in a cold voice, "Don't think that no one in the world knows about the shady business between you and the northern Qi people. In the past it didn't matter, but what is the situation now? Once the 2 sides go to war, what you are doing is aiding the enemy. Instead of quickly washing yourself of it, you still want to use this relationship to gain some benefits. Don't think that just because your identity is special, no one will suspect you of treason." "Treason my ass," Fan Xian scolded laughingly. "Am I not also in a hurry to earn money? Besides, most of the money I don't have to spend myself. You've also seen the accounts sent to the Hangzhou conference and the River Works Yamen in the past. I don't understand this. In any case, you're giving this money to the court. Why do you have to make a detour in the middle? Most importantly, by avoiding taxes in the middle, the court gets even less money. Fewer procedures means one less bad experience of being skinned alive by officialdom, Fan Xian said. Furthermore, I like to control these things myself. The palace must know about these things. The emperor has been enduring silently. You know why? Don't go overboard. Yan Bingyun couldn't resist reminding him. The eldest princess can get it, but I can't? Fan Xian said. The monk can touch, so can I. Why did you change the topic again? Are you willing to do what I asked you earlier? If you are, then I have to quickly send a letter to Shangjing. Her family is all dead. In any case, she won't return to northern Qi. Why care about that? Yan Bingyun shook his head. There will always be a day when one returns to one's homeland. Fan Xian smiled and patted his shoulder. Find a quiet place. There are some important things I need to discuss with you. Yan Bingyun's expression immediately became serious. Let's do it here. No one in my manor would dare to eavesdrop on anything. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and acknowledged the other's confidence. Yan Ruihai was a spy the Overwatch Council had placed in the military for decades. Yan Bingyun was also one of the most successful spies in the history of the Qin kingdom. Such a father and son pair would certainly have sharp eyes and would not allow an unreliable person to remain in the manor. I am about to take over the position of director, Fan Xian said quietly as he looked at the drizzle sliding down the corridor. There was no expression of surprise on Yan Bingyun's face. Chen Pingping had long stopped looking at matters. There was no difference between Fan Xian and the director. As for whether or not he would immediately take over the position of commissioner, he did not care much about this matter. Since Fan Xian had spoken, after a moment of silence he still said, "Congratulations." Fan Xian lowered his head and quietly said, "That is why I need you to quickly draw up a plan. I want to be a true director." Yan Bingyun's gaze froze and he stared at him quietly. It was as if he wanted to discern the other party's true meaning from his words. Including your father, the bald head of the 7th Bureau, and even the old servant by the old cripple's side, their control over the council is far above what we can imagine. Fan Xian seemed to not feel his gaze and coldly said, "If I want to be a true director, I have to let the old comrades rest completely. These people must be kept out of council affairs." You mean to have Director Chen completely break away from the Overwatch Council so that even if he wanted to extend his hand he wouldn't be able to? That is exactly what I mean. Even with Yan Bingyun's calmness he couldn't help but feel boundless shock. He stared at Fan Xian in a daze, not knowing why he would suddenly have such a thought. A moment later, he smiled angrily and said, "You want me to deal with my own father? It's a metabolism." Fan Xian smiled. "It has nothing to do with dealing. It's just separation." "I need a reason," Fan Xian said after a moment of silence. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "I'll tell you a story about the wind and snow in the valley." After finishing the story, Fan Xian looked at Yan Bingyun. "I don't understand." Yan Bingyun's expression was rather ugly. The old director cherished him so much. How could he do those things? "I also don't believe it." Fan Xian lowered his head in pain. "But the emperor seemed to have found something. If the emperor truly believed this and the old cripple really wanted to kill me, what do you think the conclusion would be? The emperor once summoned you into the palace. You are one of the 7 gentlemen in his heart. Qin Heng is dead, but there are still 6 of you young people. Help me with this and have the Overwatch Council truly fall into my hands." Sitting in the carriage heading out of the city, Fan Xian began to smile proudly again. Last night he had tricked the emperor. Today he had relied on his superb acting skills to trick Yan Bingyun. With this Overwatch Council official taking action, in addition to his conversation with Chen Pingping in a moment, presumably the matter he worried about the most would become a story that would never happen because of the Overwatch Council's complete reorganization. Behind the attack in the valley was the shadow of the Overwatch Council. If Yan Ruihai had not reported to Chen Pingping and cooperated with the Qin family, it would have been impossible for the Qin family's private soldiers at Shao Mountain and Qin Heng's concealment of the Jingdo garrison to calculate the path of Fan Xian's carriages from Jiangnan, much less launch such a fierce attack. If Chen Pingping wanted to kill Fan Xian, this alone was enough. Fan Xian had used this story to convince Yan Bingyun of his sincerity. He had also made Yan Bingyun believe that he had no intention of revenge. He only wanted to follow his old example of attacking the second prince and strike first, allowing the old director to retire peacefully. The reason he had to make such a detour was because of the matter of the shadow and Yi Qingmei. Fan Xian would not tell anyone even if he was beaten to death. He could not tell Yan Bingyun. He could not even tell his wife. How many people in the world know that you once wanted to kill me? Fan Xian sat in the quiet room in Qin Garden with a smile on his face. He listened to the babbling of a distant relative and looked at the elderly Qin Pingping beside him. Qin Pingping's expression was calm. He glanced at him coldly and said, "In order to force me to leave Jingdo, you're willing to do so. That matter was done by Yan Ruahai. Will Yan Bingyun investigate?" "I'm not hoping for him to investigate. I'm just hoping for you to quickly return home to find your first love." Fan Xian laughed loudly. "You should know that starting tomorrow, I will be the director of the Overwatch Council. You are just a lonely old man who has retired early. What will you use to fight me?" After these words were said, Fan Xian suddenly fell silent. He said heavily, "You promised me to let go at the beginning. You said you had thought it through but you didn't, so I can only force you to leave." "You bastard." Qin Pingping coughed as he cursed. "I don't care about anything anymore and you're still worried?" Chapter 651. Canvassing for votes was really tiring, but I still had to do it. This was because monthly votes were like stubborn horses. If you didn't use all your strength, they wouldn't move forward. However, I was really out of words. I had to save the golden sentence for canvassing for votes for the last day. Of course, the main purpose of that sentence was just for fun. Speaking of which, what kind of attitude should I use to convince everyone to vote for me? I didn't know. Although I wrote a lot this month, it definitely wasn't a lot. It was just a bit faster for me. At the same time, it was naturally a bit crude. If I wanted to fight for feelings, I felt that after writing about the year of Qingyu for a year and a half, I was afraid that Xu Fei's feelings would be too mushy and I would write my proclamation for canvassing for votes into Qiangyao prose. The flames of war spread through October. Monthly votes were worth 1,000 taels of gold. The position on the monthly votes list was dangerous. Those at the front were at a disadvantage and those at the back were greatly frightened. After thinking about it, I could only sincerely say, I need monthly votes. Those who are willing to vote for me, please help me out. Chapter 652. One person's sorrow could not make the entire Qin Garden fall. The sorrow on Fan Xian's face always made one feel it was mischievous and mocking. Qin Pingping sat in the wheelchair and looked at the young man in front of him. He couldn't resist smiling. It had been 5 years since Fan Xian first saw Qin Pingping. During these 5 years he had seen Qin Pingping grow old and silent. He had experienced the terror of this elder, but he had never realized that Qin Pingping's smile would one day appear so pure as a child's. For some reason, the dark aura that usually shrouded the wheelchair had long since disappeared. Today, Qin Pingping looked like a believer who had been a vegetarian for his entire life. His entire body exuded a refreshing and pleasant aura, as if he was transparent from the inside out. Fan Xian stared at his face in a daze. He knew that one's appearance came from one's heart, but he didn't know what kind of mental journey had made Qin Pingping become like this. The old man's eyes were slightly indifferent, but they were not the emotionless coldness. They were calm as he looked at Fan Xian lightly. Slowly he said, "Other than that poison, what else is there?" "There's a lot more. We've talked about it before." Fan Xian sighed and stared into Qin Pingping's eyes. "You had Sir Fei pass by Dongyi and did everything in his power to protect Sigu Jian's life." From this point on, Fan Xian no longer used a questioning tone. Instead, he began to speak each word like he was stating a fact. He did everything in his power to prolong your life because he could see clearly that the longer you lived, the greater the chance of you and the Emperor falling out. Fan Xian continued with his head lowered. Fan Xian lowered his head and continued, "You allowed Sigu Jian to live this long because you had long planned to have the Sword Hut reveal the Shadow's identity and force the Emperor to act against you." Force? Qin Pingping smiled as if he had heard an interesting word. Fan Xian was not moved by the old man's smile. He sighed and said, "As for your poisoning 3 years ago, it seems very clear now. You used this to not enter the capital and allowed the eldest princess and Empress Dowager to mess around in Jingdo. Nominally, you were obeying the Emperor's secret edict and letting the dogs into the courtyard. In reality, you had a bigger plan." He laughed at himself and said, "I was in a critical situation at that time, so I didn't think too deeply about it. Only later did I understand. The eldest princess chief strategist, Yuan Hongdao, and the old Qin master's most trusted Overwatch Council spy, Yan Ruahai, were all your trusted aides. Although you were in the wilderness, you were clear about the situation of the rebellion. With these two people secretly helping you, if you wanted to help the Emperor control the situation, Jingdo would not have fallen into such chaos." Qin Pingping laughed, his voice a little sharp. Then tell me, why didn't I control the situation? You wanted the situation to be a bit more chaotic. You wanted everyone in the palace to die. Fan Xian lowered his head and faintly said, the emperor set a fire, but you allowed the fire to burn too brightly. Too many people died. You were hoping that in the end, when the world turned white, only boss and I would be left to clean up the mess. The problem is, there's one thing you haven't explained. Why did I betray His Majesty? Do I have the power to make it so that only you and Prince Huqing remain in Jingdo? You have this ability. I have never doubted this. If the emperor had actually died on Dong Mountain, Yuan Hongdao and Yan Ruohai would not have been able to be used at all. You would have directly abandoned Yuan Hongdao. Fan Xian looked at Qin Pingping and felt a strange taste rise in his mouth. It was slightly bitter and sour. As for why you betrayed the emperor, you and I both know. Qin Pingping laughed and patted the arms of the wheelchair. It was like he was patting a strong Diabolo in the wind, making a buzzing sound. He was silent for a long time. He stared fixedly into Fan Xian's eyes like he was staring at a similarly young person many years ago. Darkly he said, shouldn't I? Fan Xian was silent. He had no idea how to respond to this question. As a son he couldn't say he shouldn't. He had always been shocked by Qin Pingping's bone-deep longing for Yi Qingmei and his desire for revenge that could burn everything. Qin Pingping was the emperor's closest official. Ever since he was young he had served in King Cheng's manor. He and Yi Qingmei met very late and presumably did not spend much time together. It was because of this woman who was like a passerby in his life that the leader of the darkest special forces in the world hid a dagger in his heart for over 20 years. It pierced his heart and everyone's hearts. Qin Pingping suddenly lay back tiredly on the wheelchair and said, you don't understand the past. You don't understand. Fan Xian had not personally participated in the events of the past, so he did not easily say he understood. He was silent, calculating and enduring silently. He had no idea how to deal with it. If there was only hatred between people, perhaps this world would be much simpler. However, the relationships between people were always so complicated. I also understand the second reason you took the poison. Fan Xian looked at Qin Pingping's eyes that were as still as an ancient well. Suddenly his heart throbbed with pain. He felt that the matters of the world were indeed somewhat hurtful. You had thought that the emperor would never be able to return from Dong Mountain. You have also destroyed his kingdom. You have been ruler and official for a lifetime. You should accompany him on the road to the Yellow Springs. You can consider it fulfilling your duty as ruler and official. Qin Pingping closed his eyes and said, after all, I have watched the emperor grow from a child to an emperor. I understand him too well. He is someone who is afraid of being alone. I am worried that he will be afraid on the road to the underworld alone, so I want to accompany him. Accompany him? Fan Xian's voice became harsh. He has killed enough people. There will be many people accompanying him on the road to the Yellow Springs. Do you need to be like this? He calmed his emotions and said in a heavy voice, furthermore, he is not dead. It is always very difficult for a person to die. For the first time in front of Fan Xian, Qin Pingping sighed and said these words. Looking at him, he slowly said, I have never underestimated the emperor. Before and during my plans, I have always been cautious and prepared for all possibilities of failure. Even if I failed, I would not leave behind anything that could be used against me or drag you down. Fan Xian looked at Qin Pingping. A powerful feeling of worship suddenly rose in his heart. He was too familiar with this old cripple. There were many things that he had not hidden from him. Thus, he knew more about what Qin Pingping had done than the emperor in the palace. In this world, Qin Pingping was probably the only person who could secretly plot against His Majesty and hide it from His Majesty. The founder of the Overwatch Council was truly too powerful when it came to scheming. He was so powerful that he did not have to purposely weave anything. He just went with the flow of the world and occasionally smeared a few dark colors. He had once caused the emperor and the Qin kingdom to sink into a situation that could be beyond redemption. However, the emperor's own strength was too powerful. He was powerful to the point where he could easily tear apart all schemes. However, Qin Pingping was truly powerful. Even so, he still did not reveal any tiny loopholes. He had even arranged an escape route many years ago. Qin Pingping did not care about life or death. What he cared about was Fan Xian's safety after his death. That was why, starting from the Hanging Temple and after the shadow accidentally stabbed Fan Xian, he began to arrange everything, including the attack in the valley and even the matter in the palace. He was cutting off Fan Xian and Fan Xian. Even if it came to light in the future, these things that were hidden in the depths would become a cleavage between Qin Pingping and Fan Xian. In front of the evidence that he had painstakingly found, the emperor would believe that Chen Pingping wanted to kill Fan Xian and that Fan Xian had nothing to do with Chen Pingping's matter. As for why Chen Pingping wanted to kill Fan Xian, that was a question for the emperor to ponder. Fan Xian had been heavily injured in the Hanging Temple incident and almost died. The valley was also extremely dangerous. These two pieces of evidence were too powerful. Fan Xian could feel Chen Pingping's painstaking efforts. Looking at his old face and sensing the fresh air that rose from his heart was moved, but he didn't know what to say. Chen Pingping's expression was incomparably calm. You should have already thought through these things 3 years ago. That day before the Qin garden recovered, you also said something similar. Why are you doing it again today? The emperor will always be suspicious, particularly after you played such a trick in Dongyi, Fan Xian said. I can only come to clarify these things with you. The Dongyi matter was arranged 3 years ago. After I promised you to let go, I already let go, Chen Pingping said with a smile. I don't care. Since you want to let go, then be more thorough, Fan Xian said. The emperor has already made me the director of the Overwatch Council. You can completely retire. Retire? That would be no different from my current life. Fan Xian smiled strangely. You still dare to say such words in front of me? If you are not willing, even if I am the director of the Overwatch Council for another 10 years, the Overwatch Council will still be yours. Oh no. Chen Pingping also smiled. The Overwatch Council is the emperor's. Oh no. Fan Xian mimicked his tone and sighed. 20% of the Overwatch Council is the emperor's, 30% is mine, and the other half is yours. It will always be yours. Having been in the Overwatch Council for so long, Fan Xian knew the frightening degree of control the old cripple in front of him had over the Overwatch Council. The so-called Emperor's private special forces had long become his private organization under Chen Pingping's old hands. This was because the Emperor had never doubted the loyal dogs at his side. It was also because Chen Pingping's prestige in the Overwatch Council was too high. There were too many officials who swore loyalty to him. Fan Xian did not doubt one thing. If the palace issued an edict to deal with Chen Pingping, people like Yen Ruahai and the bald head of the 7th Bureau would not even think before standing behind Chen Pingping. Everything for the Qin Kingdom? In the hearts of the Overwatch Council officials, perhaps the Qin Kingdom was the emperor. In the hearts of the middle-level officials who truly held power, other than Chen Pingping, there was no one else. What exactly do you want to do? Chen Pingping asked as he looked at Fan Xian with an expression of admiration. This seemed to be a normal question, but it was also like some kind of change between the two Overwatch Council directors. Fan Xian suddenly hung his head dejectedly and said, Before I came today, I had already seen Yan Bingyun. I had him begin to prepare to gather the 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council, as well as the 4th Bureau's branches in the various counties, and cut off all possibilities of you extending into the council. However, I know that if you don't pull back, just Yan Bingyun and I alone will not be able to do much. Have Yan Bingyun deal with his old man? Chen Pingping chuckled. That's not a bad move. Although, the old man he has to deal with will certainly be much more than he imagines. The old man he spoke of referred to the upper echelon of the Overwatch Council officials who were completely loyal to Chen Pingping. Fan Xian sat forward and gently held Chen Pingping's tightly furrowed hands. Let go. If you let go, why are you still holding onto my hand? Chen Pingping smiled slightly. You can try to cut off the hand I extend into the council. However, I can promise you that the old men are more powerful than you imagine. Those old men were the first nest of eggs the Overwatch Council had laid at the beginning of the Dragon Flag. They had countless disciples in the council. It would be incomparably difficult to clean out these old men. Fan Xian cursed in his heart. On the surface he said angrily, You said that the two of us have gotten along well these years. We are no different from father and son. Is there a need to fight a battle with me at this time? The key question is, you still haven't convinced me. Why should I let go? Chen Pingping's gaze was very interesting. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, The emperor has already begun to investigate the attack in the valley and the Hanging Temple matter. One day he will suspect you. Even if he can't find any evidence, this matter is always dangerous. Furthermore, you know that the emperor's personality has changed a lot ever since so many people died in the palace. If it had been in the past, he would probably have used lightning-fast methods the moment his suspicions grew. However, he has never done so. These words were true. The Overwatch Council was one of the powers the emperor relied on the most. His trust in Chen Pingping was also an anomaly in the world. Once he discovered that Chen Pingping had other intentions in his heart, If it had been the emperor of the past, he would probably have flown into a rage long ago. We've talked about this topic before. Qin Pingping nodded. The emperor has some affection for me. Even if he has some suspicions, he can't bear to act directly. He would rather wait for me to die of old age. Yes, the problem is that you never die, Fan Xian nodded. It's fine if you don't die, but your heart doesn't die either. So, I can only ask you to leave Jingdo and return to your hometown to find your first love. Qin Pingping smiled and scolded. He then suddenly asked, if I don't retreat, what will you do? I will begin to act, Fan Xian said after a moment of silence. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, even if I have to make a mess in the Overwatch Council, I will still beat you down. With what reason? Of course, it is because I found that Director Chen's shadow was behind the attack in the valley. As a prince and the next director of the Overwatch Council, I attacked with hatred and wanted to put you to death, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, regardless of whether or not I can win in the end, the emperor will always think that I have also found out about this matter and will watch me fight. In the end, he will issue an edict to chase you out of the capital. On one hand, it fulfills my wishes and fills my grudge. On the other hand, it protects your life and completes the affection between you two. Qin Pingping's grizzled brows rose. Thinking about it, you also used this matter to convince Yan Bingyun? Fan Xian nodded. Using a non-existent grudge to hide the true danger within. Qin Pingping thought for a long time and then nodded. You've improved a lot compared to before. Fan Xian smiled and said, I thought about it for a month. Knowing that the internal court had begun to investigate the valley matter, I thought of using this point. Qin Pingping smiled tiredly. He knew what Fan Xian was worried about and why he had to go through so much trouble to force him to leave Jingdo. Just as Fan Xian's heart had been moved earlier, this head of special agents, who had been alone and bitter his entire life, suddenly felt his heart become much warmer. I promise you I will leave Jingdo. Qin Pingping gently patted Fan Xian's hand. Fan Xian was overjoyed and chuckled. He then said, this shouldn't be a problem. Once in the Hanging Temple and once in the valley. Both times I almost died to your hands. No matter what the internal court finds, it will only be a footnote for you to quietly leave Jingdo. Thinking of when you charged into Qin Garden in a wheelchair and yelled at me, it was very interesting, Qin Pingping said with a slight smile. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. At the time, he truly didn't understand why Qin Pingping wanted to do these things. It was only later when the eldest princess completely enlightened him that he understood exactly what Qin Pingping wanted to do and why he had been carefully preparing to completely sever ties with him. The Taiping courtyard murder case was done by Qin Yi, right? Fan Xian suddenly said. Qin Pingping glanced at him and lightly said, Qin Yi is only one of the emperor's dogs. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, in the end, the Qin family wanted to rebel because of my existence? Of course you are Yi Qingmei's son. Qin Pingping smiled. Qin Yi, that old dog, had been hidden by the emperor for many years, but he understood the emperor's intentions too well. If the emperor planned on using you in an important position, then he would not have let you know the story from back then. Qin Yi was the only surviving loophole in that story. The emperor wanted to help you ascend the throne and preserve the relationship between you and your father, so he had to silence you. Qin Yi had to die, Qin Pingping calmly said. Thus, Qin Yi had no choice but to rebel. In the past, Qin Pingping had always insisted on not saying these things to Fan Xian. However, now that it had come to this, there was no longer a need to hide it. He no longer wanted to drag Fan Xian into the dirty water of the past. As expected, Fan Xian took a deep breath. The warm air of spring entered his lungs, but it burned his chest. Although he had long guessed these things, hearing Qin Pingping personally confirm it still made it difficult for him to suppress the burning. 3 years ago you asked why the Qin family rebelled. Qin Pingping suddenly looked at him with great interest. Given your vision, you shouldn't be able to see so far. Who reminded you? Fan Jian? Father would never tell me these things. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. It was the eldest princess. This name came out of Fan Xian's lips. Qin Pingping also became quieter. His gaze looked at the green trees outside the window. Lightly he said, that crazy girl was also a remarkable figure. She had no idea what had happened back then, yet she was able to guess the past from these details. Truly impressive. During the Jingdo rebellion, were you in contact with the eldest princess? Fan Xian asked a question he had hidden for a long time. At the time, the Overwatch Council's reaction was truly strange. Even if it was part of the emperor's plan to have Qin Pingping lure out the unstable elements in Jingdo, Qin Pingping's response was too strange. Particularly on the eldest princess's side, it seemed that she had never purposefully paid attention to the direction of the Overwatch Council. No, Qin Pingping said with his eyes closed. There are many things that do not need to be in contact. We only need to guess each other's intentions and goals. The most ingenious plan in the world is just a flash of inspiration without any warning. Once each person's intentions come together, once it falls on paper, it falls short. Concerning these things, you have to learn well from your dead mother-in-law, Qin Pingping said with a slight smile as he opened his eyes. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and nodded his head. Qin Pingping suddenly asked quietly, "Now that you know enough, what do you plan to do in the future?" Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, "I don't know." Qin Pingping sighed with slight disappointment. "Is there evidence?" Fan Xian's voice trembled slightly. "Even a little bit of evidence. There are many things in this world that do not need evidence. Only intentions are needed. I only confirmed that person's intentions a few years ago and confirmed my own intentions." Qin Pingping's words had some similarities to Sigu Jian's way of the sword. That day the army marched to the west. The emperor was near Dingzhou. Your father was also with the army. The northern Qi army suddenly moved south. I led the Overwatch Council north to Yanjing. Yi Zhong was also moved to the rear of the Western Army. Qin Pingping only coldly stated a fact. Most importantly, your mother had just given birth to you and was weak after giving birth. Fan Xian's brows gradually furrowed. What about Uncle Wuzhu? I still don't understand why he would leave his mother's side at that time. Someone from the temple came. Qin Pingping smiled slightly. An emissary appeared on the land. Although I'm not sure exactly where your mother came from, I can guess that she, Wuzhu, and the temple have always had some connection. Furthermore, Wuzhu has always been very afraid of anything related to the temple. Someone from the temple came more than once. It was at least 2 times. I know of 2 times. Qin Pingping sighed. Each time they came, Wuzhu killed them. At that time, it seemed that the only people who could threaten your mother were the people from the temple. Wuzhu did not allow those people from the temple to come within 100 li of your mother. So Wuzhu left. But your mother still died. Died? At the hands of one of our own. Qin Pingping smiled strangely. He enunciated the words, "one of our own," with a particularly heavy tone. Fan Xian also smiled. His smile was particularly sincere. He then stood up and patted Qin Pingping's shoulder. I had long guessed these things. It is only after hearing them from your mouth that I realized they felt so real. Alright, don't think about these things anymore. Qin Pingping smiled and asked, "The chest should still be in your hands, right? Where is Wuzhu?" Fan Xian smiled somewhat bitterly. A moment later he said, "The chest is not here. Uncle Wuzhu had business and left." Qin Pingping made a sound of acknowledgement. Once again he did not hide his faint disappointment in front of Fan Xian. Fan Xian suddenly asked with slight surprise, "You knew the chest was in my hands?" "Your father also knew," Qin Pingping said. "That's why your father didn't know." Fan Xian's expression changed slightly. It took a long time for him to digest the shock in his heart. He thought of how his father, who had already retired, had done countless things for him in secret. Involuntarily, a glimmer of nostalgia rose in his heart. Once again he patted Qin Pingping's thin shoulder and smiled. "You want me to learn from the dead eldest princess. I think you should learn from my still living father. When it's time to let go, let go. When it's time to retreat, retreat." He placed his 2 hands on Qin Pingping's shoulders and used a little force. "Leave the future matters to me." Qin Pingping smiled and didn't say anything. He only thought to himself that given this child's personality, he would probably continue to watch and endure. However, he didn't know how long he would have to watch and endure for. There were many bitter lovers in the world, and someone with Fan Xian's background was, without question, the most bitter kind. Thinking of this, Qin Pingping suddenly felt that his and Fan Xian's 20 years of hard work had not been in vain. At least, Fan Xian had grown up healthily. Furthermore, he had grown up quickly. It seemed that he had only spent 1 night. Regarding Fan Xian, it is truly very painful for me to write. Many times I am thinking about what I would do if I were Fan Xian. However, I can't find an answer. Although the outline has long been decided, it is still very difficult to continue writing. I will try harder to think and think. Chapter 653. The sky had darkened in an instant, but there were still no tears. Fan Xian's expression was slightly dark. He half leaned against the window and looked at the mountain path and the well-protected green hills and wild forests on the outskirts of the capital. He was silent for a long time without saying a word. The black carriage followed the flat but undulating stone path and drove diagonally onto the official road, leaving the boundaries of Qin Garden. However, Fan Xian's expression did not relax. The Overwatch Council officials around him looked at the still handsome but particularly indifferent face by the window. They all felt a strange chill in their hearts. They didn't know what had happened in Qin Garden, what the old director and the commissioner had said, or why the commissioner's expression was so serious today. The carriage drove silently on the official road toward Jingdo. Along the way, it occasionally came across commoners entering the city or young men and women from the families of officials returning from a walk. These black carriages were like a silent warning light. When everyone saw them, they hurriedly moved to the side and made way for the black carriages. The commoners were naturally respectful toward the officials, but the young nobles, who were usually not afraid of anything, knew the identity and power these black carriages represented. The nobles in Jingdo had many eyes and ears. They knew that Sir Fan Jr. had rushed back to Jingdo from Dongyi last night. In this world, no one dared to offend Fan Xian. Even these young nobles, who had been trained to be incomparably arrogant by their hormones, could only restrain their qi and focus in front of these black carriages and not make a sound. Sir Fan Jr. was famous for being ruthless and arrogant. He didn't care which lady or duke stood behind these young men. 4 or 5 years ago, outside Baoyue brothel, Fan Xian had broken the legs of a dozen little brats. This story had long shocked the hearts of all the other little brats. Fan Xian did not notice the movement on the official road. He also did not look at the timid young men who had stopped their horses to the side. He only looked silently at the scenery by the side of the official road with an unusually heavy heart. In the past, guessing was just guessing and thinking was just thinking. His elders had never said anything to him, so he could temporarily pretend he didn't know any of this and was only preparing in secret. He could only treat it as an unconscious action and not from the bottom of his heart and torment for some clear goal. But now, everything was laid out clearly in front of him. He had to face the story of the past and make his own choice. At this time, the black carriage had reached a fork in the road. Not far ahead was the majestic city of the capital. On the left was a quiet and secluded road, hidden by the green bamboo forest. Where should they go? Turn left. Fan Xian, who was leaning against the window, narrowed his eyes and softly instructed. Mu Feng glanced at him and didn't dare to say anything. He made a hand gesture and the 3 black carriages quickly turned left into the bamboo forest and disappeared from everyone's sight. Not far into this road, the green bamboos gradually became sparse, and one could see the clear green jade-like river on the side of the road. The river flowed slowly, and if one did not look carefully, one would think that it was a lake. It was the Lujing River that passed through the city, circled around the city, and finally reached the Tsang Mountains in the west. Somewhere upstream, this river gathered colorful lanterns on the pleasure boats, and gathered half of Jingdo's erotic prosperity. Even though Fan Xian's Baoyue brothel had suddenly risen, it still did not completely steal away the flavor of this river. By the time the Lujing River reached the outskirts of Jingdo and came to this bamboo forest and green trees, it was already much quieter and quieter, particularly the courtyard on the small peninsula across the river. In this bright and beautiful spring, it suffused with a fresh and elegant flavor and added a sense of being aloof from the world and independent. Taiping Courtyard, the courtyard of the mistress of the Yi family. Later, it became the courtyard of the royal family. During the Jingdo Rebellion, the eldest princess had once lived there for 2 days. She had only stayed there for 2 days before the courtyard returned to its silence. It was as if no one had ever lived there. Fan Xian got off the carriage and looked calmly at the courtyard. He thought of the people who had once lived in the courtyard and became absent-minded for a moment. After the Jingdo Rebellion had been quelled, the emperor had hinted twice that he was going to bestow this courtyard to Fan Xian again. Fan Xian knew that it was best not for him to bring up this matter, so he had always treated it calmly. For some reason, this matter never came to fruition in the end. In the summer of the 5th year of the Qin calendar, after staying a night in the Fan clan's country estate outside the city, Fan Xian had brought his sister here and kowtowed twice to Taiping Courtyard to express his sorrow. He did not go in because he knew that the emperor had a different kind of feeling toward this courtyard and a different kind of fear. Later, Fan Xian still went in. He and Uncle Wu Zhu found the bullets for the heavy sniper rifle in a secret room in Taiping Courtyard. They also wandered inside for a long time. The 2 of them did not care about the royal guards at all. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. His gaze shone through the faint moisture on the river. It was as if he was going to pierce through the greenish-gray walls of Taiping Courtyard and see everything inside. There was no grave inside. This was a fact that Fan Xian had long confirmed. His father, Fan Jian, had once told him in private that Yi Qingmei's grave was in a secluded place. Later he had pointed out that it was in Taiping Courtyard, but it was not there. Later Fan Xian thought it was in the royal palace, but it was not there either. There was only a painting of a yellow-clothed woman. Yi Qingmei was no longer in this world. It was not important where she was buried. However, Fan Xian would occasionally think of a question. Was the emperor also afraid to face the wisp of soul underground? Fan Xian sat down by the river and lifted the front of his long robe to his knees. Very neatly he said seriously, "I am thinking about some things here. Don't let anyone disturb me." "Yes, sir." Mu Feng'er and a few of the Qinian unit close to him lowered their heads and accepted the order at the same time. Leading the guards around them, they dispersed into the depths of the bamboo forest until Fan Xian could not see them and they could not see the riverside. Don't let anyone disturb him, including these subordinates. Mu Feng'er and the others understood Fan Xian's thoughts. However, they did not understand his current mood. They retreated to a place far away and warily watched the movements on the roads around them. Sealing off the sound of the wind, they silently guessed in their hearts. The courtyard across the river was once the mistress of the Yi family's residence. This was something all the old Jingdo people knew. The mistress of the Yi family was Sir Fan Jr.'s birth mother. This was something the entire world already knew. Sir Fan Jr. had chosen to meditate here. Naturally, the things he was thinking about were thorny and important. After sitting for an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian finally felt that he was tired from sitting. The secluded forest, green bamboo, gray courtyard, still water, moss, stone, and floating leaves had all become a joke. The stone under his butt suddenly seemed particularly sharp and painful. He stood and patted the dust behind him. Furrowing his brows, he shook his head but did not leave immediately. Instead, he walked a few steps toward the riverside. Lowering his body, he scooped up a handful of slightly cold river water and splashed it on his face. It was as if he wanted to make the burning heat on his face colder. At this moment, a handkerchief was extended from the side. It was as if she wanted him to wipe away the water droplets on his face. Fan Xian was not surprised at all. Accepting the handkerchief, he randomly wiped at his face. He then reached into the river and wrung it a few times until it was slightly wet and cold. Only then did he return it with a smile and say, "You're most afraid of heat. Chill your face a bit." Fan Ruoruo, dressed in plain white clothing, smiled and accepted the wet handkerchief from her brother's hand. Carefully she wiped at her ears and cheeks. It looked like she had come in a hurry. The usual frost on her face was now completely wiped away by the flush on her cheeks. "Why have you come?" Fan Xian turned and walked toward the riverbank. Very naturally he stretched out his hand, wanting to hold his sister's hand to prevent her from falling. Unexpectedly, Fan Ruoruo did not see her brother's outstretched hand and had already walked forward. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Looks like he didn't hide anything back then. You've only been studying for a short time, but your body is much better than before." Fan Ruoruo smiled and didn't respond to this question. She replied to Fan Xian's earlier words, "Brother, you just came back last night. Why did you run out again today? Someone in Jingdo is looking for you on urgent business. Sister-in-law just had to enter the palace." The Ting family was annoyed by that person and had no choice but to find the medical shop. "I went to the first bureau to ask around and found out that you had left the city. I was just about to go to Qin Garden when I saw Mu Feng'er at the intersection. I knew you must be here, so I got out of the car to find you." The people in the council shouldn't know that Fan Xian had come to Qin Garden. However, he couldn't be bothered to pay attention to such small matters. He asked, "What is it that you're looking for me so urgently?" As the brother and sister spoke, they sat down. Just like 5 years ago, they faced the far end of the river. "It's nothing urgent. It's just that I haven't seen you in a long time. I miss you," Fan Ruoruo said with a slight smile. Fan Ruoruo said with a slight smile. Actually, if that person was bothering Miss Fan, it must be an extremely important matter. However, this intelligent girl had discovered that her brother had come to Taiping Courtyard to meditate. She must have even more trouble in her heart. She didn't want to bother him with matters of officialdom. Fan Xian thought that it was indeed impossible for anything important to happen in the officialdom of the Qin kingdom. He couldn't help smiling and shaking his head. "Since it's not something important, it's good for you to sit with me. I was just finding it a bit stuffy sitting alone." They sat for another hour. Fan Xian had some thoughts in his heart, so he didn't want to speak. He only felt that having a sister who completely trusted him sitting by his side could indeed help his emotions stabilize a bit. Fan Ruorwo didn't have any other thoughts. She only faintly thought that as long as she could sit quietly by her brother's side, it would be fine. After a long time, the sun had long passed through the top of the bamboo forest and slowly moved toward the west. The faint light became countless mottled shadows and hit the brother and sister's faces. Fan Xian's eyes happened to be blinded by the patches of light. He couldn't help but rub his eyes and sigh. Fan Ruorwo's heart jumped. She heard too much distress, hatred, helplessness, and heaviness in this sigh. She lowered her head slightly and thought for a long time. She then said, "Perhaps it's better to say what's on your mind." Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then suddenly opened his mouth and said, "My birth mother was Yi Qingmei." Fan Ruorwo was slightly startled and raised her eyes to look at him. She thought to herself that in the entire world she was probably one of the first to know this secret. Why was her brother repeating it now? She knew that Fan Xian would certainly have something else to say, so she only made a quiet hum and didn't express her confusion. "Back then I brought you here to worship the distant river. I worshipped her for bestowing this physical body on me so that I could live in this world," Fan Xian said quietly. Fan Xian said calmly, "I have come to see from afar today because I respect her actions in the past. I respect her for leaving me, her son, so many benefits. She has also given the people of this world different possibilities and more choices." Fan Ruorwo listened quietly to the side. "In my life I've never seen her appearance or heard her voice, but I've seen too many of the marks she left behind." Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then continued, "I've also seen a great deal on this trip to Dongyi. Thus, the image of her in my heart is becoming clearer and clearer. I'm also becoming more and more used to seeing her as my mother." He added in his heart, even though she didn't seem to be much older than him. "If someone harmed her back then, what do you think I, as a son, should do?" Fan Xian's brows were furrowed tightly. His brows were filled with gloom. Fan Ruorwo suddenly felt nervous. Tightly gripping the wet handkerchief in her hand, she said in a trembling voice, "Didn't those people all die? The Empress Dowager has also passed on a long time ago." Naturally, the Empress Dowager had to die. Fan Xian didn't tell his sister that the Empress Dowager had actually died at his hands. He smiled slightly mockingly and said, "But there are still some people who should have died who didn't." Fan Ruorwo didn't open her mouth to ask. She had a strong feeling that she would certainly hear a name that would make her heart jump. "I guessed a long time ago that the emperor was my father," Fan Xian said. "However, in the first 2 years I didn't see him as my father at all. Not only him, but it was also very difficult for me to see Yi Qingmei as my mother. This has nothing to do with what happened back then. It's not that I felt a sense of defeat from being abandoned. This is something that cannot be explained clearly. When he came into this world, he had already taken his soul with him. However, the relationships between people are always forged by time. This has nothing to do with blood or closeness," Fan Xian said tiredly with his head lowered. "Just like how I have seen you as my sister since I was young and will always see you as the closest person in this life, time can always change many things. Time can always change many things. After being with His Majesty for so long, I could feel that he treated me differently than his other sons. Particularly these few years, the Emperor has changed too much." He suddenly smiled. His smile was slightly cute. "Tell me, if the Emperor had killed my mother back then, what would I have done?" Fan Ruorwo's heart jumped. Her hands unconsciously tightened and squeezed out the last few drops of water from the handkerchief. "The brother who voted for 600 new tickets in the year of Qingyu, I'm crying. I watched with my own eyes as so much money floated away from my eyes. It is so painful that I wish I were dead. A lazy person like me with nothing to do really can't do it. I can only drool, especially these few days. However, I still have to sincerely say thank you." Chapter 654. The sky above Jingdo was alternating between cloudy and sunny. It was impossible to accurately reveal a smile or a worried expression, such as Fan Ruorwo's face. This girl's face alternated between green and white. Her slightly sweaty and slightly red cheeks had been scared into a theater after hearing these words. She fully displayed the emotions a Qing Kingdom citizen should be displaying at this time. It was clearly a warm spring day, but Fan Ruorwo's body seemed to be tortured in an icehouse. A moment later she said in a low, trembling voice, "I don't know." This was the most useless answer, but it was also the most natural answer. Fan Xian had already fallen into a black hole and was unable to free himself. If he held his sister's hand at most, he would have another pitiful junior torn to pieces. It would not be of much help to the matter. Fan Xian's heart softened. He gently stroked the girl's head and warmly said, "Don't be scared, silly. It's just that there's no place to reason with, so I can only talk to you." After a long time, Fan Ruoruo looked at her brother with a timid gaze and said in a mosquito-like voice, "Is it true?" Fan Xian was silent for a long time. His gaze turned to the quiet and secluded little courtyard across the river. He thought of the bloody knife disaster this little courtyard had suffered 20 years ago. He thought that perhaps 20 years ago, this place had been hell on earth. Who knew how many people of the old Yi family had died, and that stunningly talented girl had coincidentally been at the weakest stage of her life. She had given birth to him. Furthermore, all the people around her that she could rely on had, for one reason or another, all left her side for important reasons that could not be turned back. She was alone and without help. This was a sudden attack from the place closest to her, a fierce and decisive killing intent. Presumably when she left this world she must have been unsatisfied and lonely, right? Borrowed seed? Fan Xian would not believe this. He understood women too well. Even if this woman was his mother, the one and only Yi Qingmei in the world, Fan Xian still did not believe it. If she had no feelings for a man, how could she charm him into her bed? Other women might feign civility with a man they didn't like because of social or family reasons, but did Yi Qingmei need to? Fan Xian stared in a daze at the other side of the river. A cold smile rose to the corners of his lips. That man was truly cold-blooded. A trembling voice pulled Fan Xian back from the tragic scene of the past. Fan Ruoruo clung tightly to her brother's side as if she was afraid of the cold. The wet handkerchief in her hand had long fallen to the grass. Her hand gripped Fan Xian's sleeve tightly. Raising her face she said, "I used to have a brother." A chill suddenly welled up in Fan Xian's heart. He knew what his sister was talking about. He had known since he was a child that there should have been a young master in Count Sinan's manor. That young master should be about the same age as him. He was the son of his father and first wife. However, because of his weak body he died at a young age. At this moment, his sister suddenly mentioned the elder brother who had long since disappeared from people's memories. Fan Xian vaguely seemed to catch on to something, and his expression immediately changed. Chen Pingping had reminded Fan Xian more than once to treat Fan Jian better, because the Fan family had sacrificed a lot for his survival. What did the Fan family pay? Could it be that the reason he was able to survive in Taiping Courtyard and endure until Uncle Wu Zhu hurried back was because under the fierce attacks of the Empress Dowager, the Qin family and the Empress's clan, someone had accepted death in his place? Fan Xian's face was slightly pale. He thought silently to himself, if this was how things had progressed, first it was hidden from the Empress Dowager. Later, when Count Sinan raised an illegitimate child in Danzhou, why did the palace not become suspicious? Had the emperor suppressed the situation after returning to the capital and sealed off the news? His head hurt slightly. There were some details he had not thought through clearly, but the possible terrifying scene became clear in his mind. He indifferently thought that when he opened his eyes for the first time in this world, he saw his pair of baby white lotus-like hands. In front of the hands that were stained with blood, there was already a newborn baby who had died in his place. His baby-like hands were not only smeared with the blood of the people Uncle Wu Zhu had killed, but also the blood of the true young master of the Fan family. Fan Xian's body trembled slightly. Ruoruo clearly sensed her brother's abnormality. Sorrowfully she said in a low voice, "I don't know how he died. Later, I faintly heard the old nanny in the manor mention it while crying. I have some suspicions but I don't know what went wrong." Fan Xian gently held his sister's hand and didn't say a word. He knew that not long after giving birth to Ruoruo, Ruoruo's birth mother was bedridden and died. It was only later that his father welcomed Lady Lu into the manor. What was it about the wife of an assistant minister that had been troubled all this time? Was it because her own son had died when he shouldn't have? Ruoruo then lowered her head and quietly said, "I heard the old nanny say that mother and auntie should also know each other." Fan Xian had gradually come to understand the deeper meaning of Chen Pingping's words. But he still didn't understand. If Chen Pingping knew that his father had paid such a great price for him, why did he still refuse to lower his guard against his father all those years ago? The relationship between Count Sinan and Yi Qingmei was not like the first love that Fan Xian had imagined when he was young. Perhaps the two of them trusted each other more like siblings, just like Fan Xian and Ruoruo today. Yi Qingmei had just given birth to a son in Taiping Courtyard. It was normal for Count Sinan's wife to go to the courtyard to help. As for what happened afterward, Perhaps it was just as Fan Xian guessed. Was it like the plot of a novel? It turned out that reality was always more bizarre than fiction. More accurately, reality should always be more bizarre than fiction. Fan Xian tightly held his sister's hand. His heart was filled with countless complicated feelings. Before his eyes floated the face of his grandmother, who had always loved him dearly, and the solemn face of his father. It seemed that he would never be angry, never be happy, and that he would only silently walk the bureaucracy. His heart suddenly ached. He felt that he owed the Fan family too much. His heart suddenly grew cold. Back then, too many people had died and too much blood had been shed. Fan Xian stood up and looked coldly at Taiping Courtyard across the river. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Don't tell anyone about what we talked about today." Although he knew that his sister would certainly not spread this shocking secret, Fan Xian still couldn't help but remind her. He then said in a low voice, "Concerning this matter, I have to ask my father in person. Brother is returning to Danzhou?" Ruoruo followed suit and stood up, looking at him in surprise. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Father is not in Danzhou right now. The retired Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, was living out his retirement in Danzhou." This was something everyone knew. But Fan Xian said with unusual certainty that his father was not in Danzhou because only he knew that his father was in a place in the northeast, helping him do something important. He had to ask his father in person because he believed that on this matter, his father also had the right to speak. Fan Ruoruo resisted the urge to ask. She only stared in a daze at her brother's gloomy face. Her heart ached slightly. She knew that the things Fan Xian said today would stir up a great storm in the future. Fan Xian was not only the second most powerful person in the world, he also had too much power in his hands. If he truly had a falling out with the emperor and wanted to avenge his mother, a great battle between ruler and official would probably drag the entire world into it. "Come with me to another place." Fan Xian walked toward the path deep in the bamboo forest. Ruoruo made a sound of acknowledgement and followed with small steps. 3 black carriages left the bamboo forest near Taiping Courtyard and came to another eerie place on the outskirts of the capital. The coldness of this place was different from Taiping Courtyard. It gave off a sense of fear because this was a cemetery. Many people had been buried in Taiping Courtyard. Many people had also been buried here. Fan Xian had left his old home and come to a place of death. The Overwatch Council officials following behind him all felt a chill. They didn't know what exactly had happened. The feng shui at the foot of the Green Mountain on this side was very good. Buried were the graves of the nameless soldiers left behind by the Qin Kingdom's wars from south to north. Among them, the newest and largest cemetery had been built 3 years ago. During the Jingdo Rebellion, the imperial soldiers had suffered heavy casualties. The Overwatch Council had also paid a terrifying price, particularly the attack on Qin Heng's vanguard camp at Jingyang Gate and the Black Knight's later valiant pursuit in front of the square, which added 1,000 more graves to the new cemetery. The traditional April festival had just passed, so there were still many traces of worship left in the cemetery. Incense and unburned paper money floated quietly in the mountain wind among the graves. Fan Xian brought his subordinates and sister to the graves and bowed deeply toward the cemetery. The people buried here were all his subordinates. They were all people who had died because of his one decision and one plan. Only now did Mu Feng-er and the other subordinates know what the commissioner wanted to do. They felt deeply moved and moved. He was about to take over as director of the Overwatch Council. Unexpectedly, after returning to the council to deal with matters, the first thing he did was come to the cemetery to pay respects to his dead brothers. Seeing the commissioner sincerely and attentively bow, the eyes of the dozens of Overwatch Council officials in Qingshan Garden couldn't help but moisten. They followed behind him and bowed. However, they had come in a hurry and had no time to set up anything. Fan Xian took a deep breath and said, "What matters is sincerity. I don't care about other things." To the side Mu Feng-er agreed. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, "After returning to the capital, have Mu Tai check on the pensions these years and how the families of the officials in the council have been taken care of. Draft a file for me." "Yes, sir." Mu Feng-er made a sound of acknowledgement and was not afraid. The follow-up matters of the Overwatch Council's pensions were all handled by the First Bureau. His uncle Mu Tai was the head of the First Bureau. Hearing that Sir Fan Jr. was going to check the accounts, he was not worried at all. In the entire court, only the Overwatch Council's pensions were the highest. The commissioner looked after the families of his subordinates very well. Of course, it was also because Fan Xian had the palace treasury, a gold mine hidden in his sleeves. Secondly, he knew that his uncle would never dare to make a mistake in these matters. Fan Xian paid no more attention to him. With his hands behind his back, he led Ruoruo out of the cemetery at the foot of Qingshan Garden, leaving a distance behind his loyal subordinates. It was not until they were about to climb to the waist of Qingshan Garden did he turn his head to look at the densely packed graves below him. He sighed and said, "A general's success is built on the bones of tens of thousands." Ruoruo didn't understand why her brother had come here after thinking quietly for a long time in Taiping Courtyard. Fan Xian seemed to guess what she was thinking. In a low voice he explained, "I want to use these dead people to remind myself that I am no longer just me. I have to be responsible for many people who are alive and those who are dead. I have to use these graves to remind me and make me more clear-headed and calm." The brother and sister climbed past the waist of Qingshan Garden and turned to the other side. It was said that the feng shui on this side was not as good as the other side, but it was still densely packed with graves. They were all places where the ancestors of the Jingdo people were buried. At this moment the smell of smoke and fire seemed to float in the air. There were a few large graves on the col separating the two sides of Qingshan Garden. The style of the graves was normal, but they appeared very large. Furthermore, there was a garden outside the graves and soldiers guarding them. A few soldiers saw someone slowly walk in and were about to go forward and yell at him when they were immediately chased out by a few Overwatch Council swordsmen. Buried in these graves were the eldest princess, the crown prince, and the second prince. Fan Xian walked past the eldest princess grave and the crown prince's grave. His expression did not change at all. In the end, to Ruoruo's surprise, he stopped in front of the second prince's grave. The Empress Dowager's grave was far to the south of Tsang Mountain. It was 80 li from Jingdo. It was said that it took up a lot of space and was beautifully decorated. It perfectly displayed the emperor's benevolence and filial piety. However, Fan Xian had never been there even once. The Overwatch Council officials scattered in all directions. Fan Xian and his sister stood quietly in front of the second prince's grave. After looking for an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Actually, I don't like you very much because I know you and I are the same kind of person. Just as you said the night before you died, we don't like each other. From the first time I saw you, I saw through the bashful smile on your face and knew your hypocrisy." Fan Xian smiled slightly and looked at the grave. "Of course, when you saw the bashful smile on my face, you also knew my hypocrisy. However, you can't prove this. You are only subconsciously guessing. Because I hide deeper than you, my smile is more real than yours." Fan Xian's voice was not loud, but it appeared particularly determined. "When it comes to acting, no one in this world can compare to me. From the day I was born I was acting." A bashful smile? If you want to pretend to be a baby, of course you have to learn how babies smile. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. "This has already become my natural nature. I only know how to smile shyly, it's so embarrassing." He raised his head and said, "Qingzi, in the future, when I don't have to smile shyly anymore, I will come see you again." Fan Ruoruo looked at her brother in astonishment. She didn't know why he was talking nonsense in front of the second prince's grave. What did he mean by pretending to be a baby? Fan Xian stretched in front of the grave. He had long stood up, but the bashful smile on his face had become an impatient and angry expression towards the world. Fan Ruoruo finally couldn't resist reaching out her hand to touch his forehead to see if her brother had a fever from the shock of the news. In the end, the place she touched was icy cold. Fan Xian was startled by her, but he immediately understood what she was thinking and laughed loudly. Hearing Fan Xian let out a rare hearty laugh, Fan Ruoruo relaxed and also laughed. However, there was still a layer of haze in her heart. Looking at her brother, she didn't know what kind of hardship and struggle there was in this laughter. Fan Xian calmed down and warmly said, "The things I wanted to do today, the crazy things I wanted to do, have all been done. Earlier you said something happened in the capital. What exactly is it?" Fan Ruoruo hesitated for a moment and then quietly said, "The young lady of the Sun family has come to the manor. Fortunately, sister-in-law is not here, she has made Master Ting very anxious." Sun Jingxiu's daughter? Fan Xian paused for a moment. How did a young lady of a noble family make such a fuss? This young lady of the Sun family was the Fan who had helped Fan Xian greatly during the Jingdo rebellion. However, Fan Xian knew this girl's personality. No matter how much she loved the story of the stone, she would not do something so damaging to her family's reputation. She came for her father? Fan Ruoruo glanced at him probingly. Something seems to have happened on Sir Sun's side. He was so anxious that he couldn't do anything. I think Miss Sun was also forced to come by her father. A gust of wind came from the mountains and made Fan Xian's clothes flap loudly. It made his brows furrow. He couldn't resist cursing. However, his voice was very low. Even Fan Ruoruo, who was standing beside him, didn't hear clearly. Concerning Fan Xian's slightly bashful smile, ever since I started writing about the year of Qingyu last year, there have been many people who disliked it. Furthermore, in many places they expressed confusion about how I wrote it. I have never explained it because this way of writing has no beauty and no box office. However, I wanted to persist. In the beginning, I persisted in writing it this way because of a very simple reason. Before I wrote about the year of Qingyu, I was wondering what kind of strange existence an adult soul would become in a baby's body. However, I wasn't writing about strange things, so I could only use some minor details to remind everyone that the slightly bashful smile was an important part. If a 20-year-old wanted to pretend to be an innocent and ignorant baby, how should he smile? How should he giggle? I have observed many children and found that there is one type of smile that is most common, and that is the slightly bashful smile. Fan Xian pretended to be slightly bashful for a long time, so when he grew up in the world of the Qing kingdom, he inevitably developed this kind of habit. This was something that I thought was necessary to make up his expression. It was a very powerful detail, but unfortunately, it was interpreted in a different direction. I really wanted to shout, "How serious am I? I am a pearl dust, go away." I shrugged. However, everyone knows that I was criticized badly, so I didn't persist with the bashful smile. There was no way around it, I wanted to eat. I was dissatisfied with myself for not being able to stick to my structure and description, but to be able to find an opportunity to explain it to everyone was something that I was very happy about. These 2 chapters confirmed Fan Xian's heart. In the future he would not write about this content. He would only do it. There are tombs in the Vermilion Bird story, and there are also tombs in the year of Qingyu because these are all very important things. Recently I haven't written much, so I haven't written much. This chapter was written in advance and posted at a fixed time, because I had things to do during the day. I don't ask for everyone's understanding because you guys are too bad. Of the 3,000 update votes, 300 were voted. Of the 6,000 update votes, more than 700 were voted. Of the 12,000 update votes, 1,500 were voted. I counted with my fingers. I earned an extra 150 a day? Nearly 400? More than 700 yuan. Then I was furious. My classmates were clearly bullying me for only writing 5,000 words today. Of course, I could still write a few dozen more words at this time, but I won't succumb to your sugar-coated bullets. Actually, it's just that if I take the money for 6,000 words, I won't feel at ease. Today, I wrote 900 words just for the epilogue alone. Speaking of which, seeing everyone having fun, I was also very happy. I had been too emotional recently. Thank you all for having fun with me, and thank you all for supporting me with so many update votes. Chapter 655. Fan Xian had already expressed all the emotions he needed to express. What he should have felt, 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 and what he should have been determined had all become fresh cement in his mind. Additionally, his sister had also spoken of the true reason she had come to find him. Naturally, he would not stay around these large graves. A group of people quickly boarded the carriage and headed into Jingdo. In the carriage, he listened attentively to his sister's account of what had happened in the manor. His furrowed brows gradually relaxed because the matter was much simpler than he had imagined. It wasn't a big matter. The matter involved the Jingdo magistrate. It should have been a big matter. However, these struggles and conflicts in officialdom were not much in Fan Xian's eyes. They were just slightly troublesome problems. She came this morning. She only said she was here to visit the princess. According to Master Teng, looking at her gaze, she probably still wants to find you, Fan Ruoruo said in a low voice. Sister-in-law has entered the palace. There is no one in charge in the manor. Additionally, she knows her identity is sensitive, so she came to find me. What is there to be sensitive about? Fan Xian raised his brow sensitively and said unnaturally. If I remember correctly, Sun Pin is not much older than Rugia. It is not too out of line for her to come to the manor to chat with you. I didn't mean it that way. Fan Ruoruo saw the uneasiness on her brother's face in a glance and smiled. However, Sun Jingxiu is holding a birthday banquet in 2 days. If he wants to invite you, he should personally send an invitation. No matter what, it would not be his unmarried daughter's turn to appear. Why would he send an invitation to me? Fan Xian smiled. He's afraid of me more than enough. I've ruined his reputation for a lifetime. Besides, he is just a third-level official. Even if he wants to do something big, he wouldn't bother me. He must have something to ask of you. Fan Ruorwo lowered her head and thought for a bit. I just don't know what troublesome matter it is. Fan Xian paused slightly. These few months, all of his attention had been placed in the direction of Dongyi. He had paid less attention to Jingdo. He didn't know what strange movements there were. However, the four seas were at peace, and the Qing kingdom's politics were unusually stable. Why would someone jump out and make trouble? After thinking for a bit, he lifted the curtain and gave Mu Feng a meaningful glance. Mu Feng understood and rode closer to the carriage. He lowered his head to listen to Fan Xian's quiet instructions and nodded repeatedly. The group of carriages entered the capital, circled around the side alley of the main street in the south of the city, and quietly stopped at the corner gate. Fan Xian got out of the car with his sister and looked around. Like a thief, he snuck in. After entering the garden, he was not in a hurry to go to the side hall to see the young lady of the Sun family. Instead, he made a shushing gesture and hid in the number 3 quiet study. Fan Ruorwo looked at him in astonishment. She thought that along the way in the carriage, it was clear that her brother was very concerned about the Jingdo government's matters. Sun Pin was clearly in the side hall. He could have just gone and asked directly. Why was he hiding here? Fan Xian looked at his sister's expression and smiled self-mockingly. After all, she is an unmarried girl. It is truly inconvenient for me to openly see her. Fan Ruorwo spat out a laugh and said, "You're afraid of that? If you really knew there were differences between men and women, you wouldn't have hidden in the young lady's boudoir for a few days 3 years ago." After these words were said, her face couldn't help but redden. Blinking, she glanced at her brother and giggled. Not only me but even Cece was later very curious. How exactly did you sleep in the young lady's boudoir those nights? Fan Xian did not laugh or get angry. He only sighed helplessly and said, "It is already my fault for a girl as clean as ice and as clean as jade to be troubled by these rumors. Each time I think of it, I feel guilty. Yet you still use this to make fun of me. It is truly not kind." Fan Ruorwo respected her brother the most. Hearing these words, she quickly became silent. However, the curiosity in her heart could not be erased. During the Jingdo rebellion 3 years ago, Fan Xian hid in the boudoir of the Jingdo government. He secretly used the Jingdo government's procedures to arrange for the Black Knights to enter the capital and make preparations for his future comeback. At the same time, he subdued the Jingdo government. This was the most talked about legend in Jingdo these years. Many people were guessing at the relationship between Sir Fan Jr. and the young lady of the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu's family. Why was that young lady willing to take such a big risk and betray her father to help Fan Xian? Why did Sir Fan Jr. strongly protect Sun Jingxiu afterward, only remember his merit and not his grudge, help him secure his position as the Jingdo magistrate, and not be implicated in the rebellion? Even Fan Xian didn't know how the story of those few nights had spread to everyone. He was worried that it would affect Sun Pinner's reputation and bring this girl too much trouble. When the rumors were at their worst, he was slightly angry and had the Overwatch Council investigate. Who knew that in the end, they would find a serving girl in the Jingdo government? Since the rumors had accidentally leaked in her garden, Fan Xian had no way of dealing with it. He could only pay special attention to his relationship with the Jingdo government. During these 3 years there had been no communication at all. Even the Jingdo magistrate, Sir Sun Jingxiu, probably knew what Fan Xian was thinking and was deeply moved. Other than official business, he didn't even send a name card to the Fan Manor. After staying in the study for a while, Mu Feng led his uncle Mu Tai in. When Fan Ruorwo heard the knock on the door, she had already hidden into the back room. Fan Xian looked at the sweaty face of the head of the first bureau, Mu Tai. Looking at his dark face, he couldn't resist saying, "Although I am in Dongyi, if there is any major movement in the capital, you have to quickly let me know." Mu Tai had already learned from his nephew that Fan Xian wanted to ask about the Jingdo magistrate's matter. He had already made preparations, but he heard the faint displeasure in Fan Xian's tone. His throat couldn't help but become dry. He didn't argue anything and directly placed the already organized files on Fan Xian's table. Fan Xian picked up the files and looked through them one by one. His brows gradually furrowed. A moment later he sighed. During the few months he had devoted himself to Dongyi, there had indeed been some movement in the capital. Not only Sun Jingxiu but the lives of a few other officials had also been wretched. The Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Appointments began to secretly investigate these officials. As for the specific matters to be investigated, there were all sorts of things. Having been in the Overwatch Council for a long time, Fan Xian knew that no yamen could be completely pure. As long as they investigated hard, no matter what the reason was, they would always find some problems. The Jingdo government was being investigated in secret by a few departments. It was beginning to bear an unbearable pressure. As the saying went, a storm was brewing. It would probably not be able to hold out much longer. The officialdom was the most sensitive. The civil and martial officials had caught wind of it. Even if they didn't add insult to injury, they began to look at it coldly. No wonder Sun Jingxiu had suddenly thought of holding a birthday banquet. He probably still hadn't figured out the palace's intentions. Was it a routine investigation, or was they preparing to use this matter to have him resign? Holding a birthday banquet could clearly see the palace's attitude. Fan Xian shook his head. He thought to himself that this magistrate did things seriously and righteously. Even if he had stood on the wrong side during the Jingdo rebellion, it had only been a technical error. It was this kind of personality that made the emperor tolerate him for another 3 years. It was also this kind of personality that made him unable to see just what the palace wanted to do. He still had the delusion that he could continue sitting in the important position of the Jingdo magistrate. Fan Xian saw at a glance the deep reason for the storm in the officialdom. The officials, including Sun Jingxiu, were all not very clean. Although Sun Jingxiu had performed a great service in the end, at the beginning, he had stood against the emperor's final edict. Those officials had not stood too firmly during the Jingdo rebellion and were suspected of being opportunists. The emperor was settling accounts after autumn. 3 years was not too late. Given the emperor's sinister personality, how could he let go of these despicable officials who had wavered in the past? Mu Tai saw that he was lost in thought. He swallowed and moistened his throat. Carefully, he reminded him, the limelight began with the Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Appointments investigation. It was definitely something that the Hall of Governmental Affairs agreed to do. This was a reminder to the commissioner that changing the Jingdo magistrate might have come from the palace. It was a reminder to Fan Xian not to clash with the emperor's intentions for the sake of a young lady of the Sun family. Fan Xian smiled. He had no interest in falling out with the emperor at a time like this. Furthermore, it was not worth it to fall out just for the position of Jingdo magistrate. Even if the emperor wanted to force Sun Jingxiu off the stage, he would not go so far as to kill him. Since it was so, he would let the emperor vent his resentment that had not been completely vented. Suddenly his heart jumped. He remembered that the emperor had once promised him to keep Sun Jingxiu safe. He shouldn't go back on his word so quickly. Even if he wanted to go back on his word, he would have to look at his face. It was impossible for him to have the Hall of Governmental Affairs appear. He furrowed his brows and asked, "Has Hu the scholar said anything about this matter?" Presently, Hu the scholar was the leader of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. If the emperor truly wanted to use the Hall of Governmental Affairs to make this arrangement, then the Hall of Governmental Affairs' inclination should have come from Hu the scholar's lips. No. Mu Tai glanced at him and said, however, that he Zongwei once said something after drinking, and the pressure on the Jingdo government increased. Everyone in the Overwatch Council, including the people in the Fan Manor, knew that Fan Xian greatly disliked He Zongwei of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Thus, no one dared to show any admiration, respect, or any other positive emotional evaluation of He Zongwei in front of Fan Xian. Fan Xian laughed coldly and said, after saying something after drinking, he made the Jingdo magistrate lose his appetite. This sir, he is quite impressive. Although he said this, he understood that given the emperor's recent trust in He Zongwei was only using his mouth to announce the emperor's intentions. If Sun Jingxiu knew what was good for him, he would have long asked to resign. However, it was clear that this Jingdo magistrate was not a clever person and did not realize this. Fan Xian thought deeply for a long time and then said, I know about this matter. Mu Tai glanced at him and did not tidy up the files on the table. He only said, even if you want to go to the Sun Manor, you only need to remind him. There is no need to do anything else. I know. You talk too much. Fan Xian waved his hand angrily and had the uncle and nephew leave. Before Fan Ruoruo came, another servant came to report that Yang Wanli had arrived. Fan Xian's spirits rose. He thought of how this bastard was doing very well in the Ministry of Works Yamen and had devoted his heart to political affairs. It had been a long time since he had come to pay his respects. How could he be free today? Fan Xian was very happy and quickly had someone invite him to the back of the manor. Unexpectedly, when Yang Wanli entered the study, his dark face was full of grievance. Yang Wanli was already the vice director of the river department of the Ministry of Works and a proper official in charge. Given this speed, it was certain that he would become a minister within 10 years. However, it was not entirely because Fan Xian was supporting him from behind. This official had experienced the tempering of the harsh sun on the Jiangnan dikes. He was no longer the pedantic scholar of the past who only knew how to talk about saving the country. Instead, he was a proper and capable official, which was why he had risen so quickly in the Ministry of Works. Thus, Fan Xian was surprised to see his expression today. The two of them said something in low voices. Fan Xian's expression became uglier and uglier. In the end, he only said a few comforting words in a low voice and had him leave. Yang Wanli rarely came to the manor to visit. Fan Xian secretly knew that he did indeed spend every day in the yamen, so he did not find it strange. On the contrary, he purposely helped him save time. After Yang Wanli left, Fan Ruoruo walked out from the back room. Furrowing her brows slightly, she said, "What is it now?" Fan Xian's expression was heavy. He thought for a moment and then replied, "It's around the same time as Sun Jingxiu's matter. Yi Zhongwei is becoming more and more arrogant. Whoever I want to protect, he extends his hand to." Fan Ruoruo listened quietly. Only now did she know that Yang Wanli's life in the Ministry of Works Yamen had not been very smooth recently. The Ministry of Revenue was also checking accounts in the Ministry of Works Yamen. The focus was on the Metropolitan Water Bureau he was in charge of. There was even the shadow of the Supreme Court and Ministry of Appointments behind it. Every year Yang Wanli had Fan Xian's silver to support him and lived well. He was also not a corrupt official. With internal and external factors added together, the accounts that passed through his hands were clear. No matter how the Ministry of Revenue investigated, they could not find any problems. Even when the Ministry of Appointments privately asked him to question him and raised doubts about his manner and the number of female servants, they were blocked by Yang Wanli with the excuse that it was a gift from his teacher. The officials of the Ministry of Appointments did not have the courage to go to the Fan Manor and ask Fan Xian for confirmation. However, on Yang Wanli's side in the end, some small details were caught. The reason was actually related to Fan Xian. This matter had to start a few years ago. In the 2 years after the river burst its banks, Fan Xian was in charge of the palace treasury. Using his own methods, his father's help, as well as Xia Mingji and Fan Xijia's routes in the north, he had scooped up a great deal of silver from the palace treasury. After a few twists and turns, he had sent it to the river transport governor's yamen at the time. At that time, Yang Wanli was still working in the river transport governor's yamen. This large sum of silver, which made countless people tremble in fear, was in his hands. There were always some carelessness in the operation of the silver, and people had something to use against him. In particular, the officials of the Ministry of Appointments faintly raised questions about where the silver had come from. If this problem were to be investigated further, it was likely that many people would die. But where did the question come from? The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. He laughed coldly and scolded, "The silver was dug out from my savings. The emperor knows this, yet he still came to investigate. He is truly generous and virtuous." He glanced at his sister and sighed. Even the Ministry of Revenue is interfering. It looks like it will be difficult for the Fan family to control the Ministry of Revenue. In a society with imperial power, Fan Xian, as an official, was shamelessly boasting about controlling the Ministry of Revenue. It was truly a rebellious complaint. However, what he said was not wrong. Back then, regardless of whether his father was an assistant minister or a minister of the Ministry of Revenue, the entire Ministry of Revenue had been organized into a solid block. Regardless of whether it was the crown prince or the second prince, they had no way of extending their hands in. Even that spring day when the emperor wanted to use the Ministry of Revenue matter to stir up some trouble, he had been blocked by Fan Jian. Back then, the Ministry of Revenue was the legendary independent kingdom, right? If it was at that time, who in the Ministry of Revenue would dare to investigate the Jingdo government and Yang Wanli, a student of Fan Xian's school? Even if they couldn't stop the higher-ups from investigating, they would probably have secretly informed Fan Xian. However, following Fan Jian's sad retirement, the emperor slowly inserted officials into the Ministry of Revenue and transferred officials. The present Ministry of Revenue was no longer the Ministry of Revenue of the past. Each time Fan Xian thought of this, he felt angry on behalf of his father, although this anger was unreasonable. After Fan Xian brought up the name Yi Zhongwei, Fan Ruoruo fell silent. Her face was slightly awkward and self-blaming. Fan Xian glanced at his sister and was silent for a moment. He then said, "Don't think too much. Yi Zhongwei alone would not dare to act against my people. This must be the palace's intention." Of course. Fan Xian lowered his head and continued. Looks like this popular sir he has also given up on the idea of a marriage alliance with our family and currying favor with me. He has decided to follow the emperor's wishes and be a loyal dog. He huffed coldly and said, Hizongwei knows that the emperor has raised him up to fight against me and that he will only die a horrible death, but he has no choice. Since it is so, he hopes to be able to truly find the big problem between me and the emperor. He incessantly stimulated me, hoping that I would truly capsize. Only then would he be able to preserve his life. Why does the emperor want to do this? This was the greatest unease and confusion in Fan Ruoruo's heart. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said self-mockingly, the emperor has already decided for me to take over the position of director of the Overwatch Council in a few days. This was something that happened naturally. Fan Ruoruo did not congratulate him. On the contrary, the confusion in her heart grew stronger and stronger. Since the emperor's favor was the same as before, why did the emperor choose to suppress her brother's power at this time? Give a carrot and you have to hit it with a stick. The emperor is always careful of his limits. This is to remind me and, in reality, to weaken me. He doesn't want to see an official with too much power in his hands. Fan Xian looked at his sister and suddenly furrowed his brows. With slight mockery he said, most importantly, the situation before us is the one the emperor has arranged for the future of the Qin kingdom. The Hall of Governmental Affairs is the center, with Hu the scholar leading the court. Below, the Overwatch Council and Imperial Censorate check and balance each other. The Overwatch Council has hundreds of officials. Only by doing this can the peace of the court be ensured. He is beginning to test the effects and see what his Qin kingdom will be like 100 years from now. But Hizongwei is also in the Hall of Governmental Affairs, Fan Ruoruo asked with confusion. This is because the power of the Overwatch Council is too great. In the past it was Qin Pingping. Of all the civil and military officials in court, including my father-in-law, who could suppress him. Later it was me. Just based on Hizongwei's identity as the Imperial Censorate of the left in the emperor's favor, it was impossible for him to oppose me, Fan Xian said. Thus, the emperor had no choice but to have Hizongwei enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs and forcefully raise his rank. Now he is helping Hizongwei cut my shoulders. Of course, if Hizongwei's power in court truly grows, the emperor will certainly help me cut him down, Fan Xian said with a smile. What bullsh** T emperor schemes in the way of balance? It's all just eating too much and having nothing better to do. Fan Ruoruo was silent for a long time. She then said, but the young lady of the Sun family is still in the side hall. Hearing this, she understood that the situation with the Jingdo magistrate was indeed urgent. However, she had heard her brother say that this was the emperor's arrangement. She had never thought that Fan Xian would be able to help the Sun family. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian was silent for a long time and then said, go tell Sun Pinner that I will go the day after tomorrow. Fan Ruoruo was startled and said, didn't you say earlier that this was the emperor's intention? Fan Xian lowered his head and crossed his hands calmly in front of his abdomen. The emperor and I had a tacit understanding 3 years ago. If it had been before, if the emperor wanted to cut my power, I would have let him cut it. So what if I let Hizongwei be arrogant for a while? But not now. He raised his head and smiled. I don't know what will happen in the future, so I have to ensure that I can still hold enough power now. You want to fight the emperor? Fan Ruoruo's eyes were wide open as she asked with unease and shock. I'm still a young man. It is always allowed to have some anger in my heart. Fan Xian smiled slightly. His smile was fresh and cheerful. There was not a trace of anger to be seen. His thoughts were actually very simple. Presently, he had to protect everyone he wanted to protect. He had to temporarily maintain the power in his hands under the pretext of being angry. Only then could he learn to face the powerful emperor head-on. Fan Ruoruo was silent for a long time. She knew that her brother had made up his mind and didn't say anything more. She just couldn't resist smiling and asking, are you really not going to keep the young lady of the Sun family company and talk? I'm very afraid that she won't be able to marry in the future. It's better not to see her, Fan Xian said helplessly. Just tell her that I am looking forward to the birthday banquet the day after tomorrow. I didn't think that while I was having so much fun yesterday, I would still stir up some trouble. It's a bit of a headache. However, I really don't have much energy, so I'm too lazy to argue. Relaxing and having fun is the right way, right? The title of today's chapter is the name of a variety show. Who has seen it? Let's talk about the last few sentences of the month. Dear leaders and comrades, we've been following that lewd old man for a whole month. Whether it's speeding up a few steps and catching up with him to intercept him, or following him intimately, We've scared him so much that his little heart is pounding. We're waiting for today, we're waiting for today. Chapter 656. I also know that these words aren't as awesome as I said a few days ago. It's mainly because of Liang Hichuan's influence. Monthly votes aren't AC Nielsen's ratings, but they're even more evil than ratings. On one hand it's the most direct ranking and on the other hand it's the most direct money. In any case I have to pull one last vote. Who knows what you bad people who only voted 3,000 words today will come up with. In short, the monthly ticket is evil, but it's also my favorite. That's you, don't turn your head to look at other people in the internet cafe, and don't look at your wife who is playing Fight the Landlord on her laptop. That's you, put down the evil monthly ticket that people love and hate. Thank you everyone for your hard work and support this month. Chapter 657. Sun Pin sat uneasily in the side hall. She sat very properly and wore a blue robe. She was so fresh and elegant that she did not seem like a guest. She was overly cautious. In the morning she had already come to the Fan Manor. Her mind had long become a mess. For a moment she was angry and embarrassed that she, a girl, had come to the manor without any shame to ask for an audience. For a moment she thought of her father sighing at home. She was very worried. In the corner of her heart, the most frantic part was occupied by Fan Xian's appearance. It had been 3 years since she had seen Sir Fan Jr. Although the serving girls often heard rumors from outside and talked about it in the room, Sun Pinner knew that he had lived well these 3 years. He had a son and a daughter and his family was harmonious. There were also no problems in court. Her heart was comforted to the extreme. Sun Pinner wanted to see Fan Xian, but she knew that if she actually saw Sir Fan Jr., it would be very inappropriate. For a moment she could not cut it off or sort it out. She hoped that he would take the time to summon her, but she also hoped that he was not in the manor and that she could go back quietly. The tea on the long table was slightly cold. Another serving girl came up to change it. This was already the 4th cup of tea. From sitting in the morning until now, the Fan Manor had not treated the young lady of the Sun family coldly. After the Ting family returned from the medical shop, they began to chat with her respectfully and calmly. After talking for a number of hours, the words from the woman's mouth did not repeat anything. Sun Pinner knew that this woman was the housekeeper of the Fan Manor and did not treat her lightly. Hearing that Princess Chen was not in the manor, she let out a breath in her heart. Everyone knew that the princess of the Duke's manor was the most gentle and amiable. She never expressed any opinion on matters of the outside world. She only did her best to host the Hangzhou conference and seek benefits for the poor people of the Qing kingdom. Her benevolent heart was greatly admired by everyone. However, Sun Pinner knew the rumors in the capital, so she was always afraid. After waiting for a long time, the Ting family only said that Junju had gone to the palace and the Duke had gone on an errand and wasn't in the fu. They didn't have a host to entertain them and asked Miss Sun to be understanding. Sun Pinner had already seen with her sharp eyes that there were officials coming in and out of the garden. She had already guessed that Sir Fan Jr. was probably hiding in the back garden and unwilling to see her. Slightly disappointed, she was about to rise to say goodbye. Unexpectedly, the Ting family refused to continue her conversation. Sun Pinner was slightly shocked. She guessed that the people in the back garden were probably discussing something about her arrival, so she calmly sat down. Before long, Fan Ruoruo walked into the side hall. Sun Pinner quickly rose and bowed. The two women looked at each other and said something in soft and warm words. Fan Ruoruo then quietly repeated what Fan Xian had told her. Sun Pinner's heart was filled with joy. She thought that if Sir Fan Jr. was willing to come the day after tomorrow, it would be wonderful. She quickly expressed her thanks, exchanged a few more polite words and was about to leave. Fan Ruoruo saw clearly the girl's joy and faint melancholy and couldn't help but sigh in her heart. She thought that her brother really had too many emotional debts. She couldn't resist saying quietly, "My brother is in the back garden." However, there are differences between men and women, so it is not convenient for him to come out and meet. Please understand his painstaking efforts. Sun Pinner's body shook. She sensed some other meaning from the sudden addition of these words from the young lady of the Fan family. It seemed that she had faintly grasped Sir Fan Jr.'s difficulties and tenderness toward her. Her cheeks blushed slightly. Her heart was filled with endless gratitude. She bowed deeply and left. Fan Ruoruo looked at the girl's back and couldn't resist laughing bitterly. She turned her head and saw Fan Xian's furtive appearance. She smiled and said, "She's already gone. What are you looking at?" She paused and then said, "But she understood your meaning." It looked like she was very grateful. Speaking of this, she couldn't resist a rare glare at Fan Xian and said, Can you not be so careful? You seem to be thinking for Miss Sun, but who knows how deeply you've sunk her." Only after these words were spoken did Ruoruo realize that her words seemed to reveal a sense of darkness. Her heart jumped and she quickly hid it with a smile. "There is something I forgot to tell you. We all misheard earlier." Fan Xian didn't pay attention to these words. He only smiled bitterly and sighed. When did being a good person become a bad thing? After successfully avoiding the young lady of the Sun family and comforting his sister, Fan Xian became idle again. Crossing his legs, he read the letters from Shi Chanli and Su Wenmao as he quietly hummed something. The diplomatic group in Dongyi was still dawdling. Sigu Jian estimated that they could hold out for another 2 days. He was not in a rush. It would be fine to stay another 6 or 7 days in Jingdo. It had been a long time since he had carefully dealt with his personal affairs. It was perfect for him to put some effort into it. Su Wenmao's position in the 3 large workshops of the palace treasury in North Min was becoming more and more stable. With Ren Xiaoan's clansman as a helper, in addition to the close cooperation between the Overwatch Council and the Palace Treasury Transport Company, the former second-in-command had now become the leader of the 3 large workshops. Of course, this was mainly because he represented Fan Xian's will. Shi Chanli was still traveling around the world. 5 years had already passed. The scholar of the past had already accepted, half helplessly and half willingly, that he had no fate with an official career. If he was truly willing, it would not be difficult for Fan Xian to arrange an official position or 2 for him. However, Shi Chanli knew that in his teacher's heart, he was not the same as the other 3. The things he had to do could not see the light of day and were more important. For the sake of Baoyue Brothel's intelligence system and silver circulation, he was willing to give up some important things to help his teacher. Of course, no one dared to disrespect the present owner of Baoyue Brothel as he traveled the world. As a merchant, Shi Chanli was actually much more at ease than officials like Ji Chang and Wan Li. Even if Fan Xian decided to have Shi Chanli re-enter the official ranks, this brothel owner would still have to think carefully. In reality, he did not understand Fan Xian as well as Sang Wen did. Fan Xian had built Baoyue Brothel all over the world. At the beginning, his starting point was truly because he pitied those pitiful women whose fates were not in their own hands. He tried to use Baoyue Brothel to influence the lowest profession from ancient times to now. He did not seek absolute justice, but at least he had to lean toward the proper. After Fan Xian finished reading Shi Chanli's letter, he couldn't resist smiling. Looking at the stammering words in the letter, Shi Chanli and Sang Wen probably couldn't resist the long years of working together and finally developing some faint feelings. Shi Chanli wanted Fan Xian to make the decision, but he didn't dare say it explicitly. Fan Xian felt that this matter was quite amusing. He had never thought of sending these 2 people to the same pile. From the beginning, he knew at Sang Wen's side there was a lonely Jianghu man who wholeheartedly wanted to be her protector. He didn't know what the situation at Sang Wen's side was like. Sang Wen's gentleness, Sang Wen's lips, and Sang Wen's attentiveness and low profile were all qualities that Fan Xian liked. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken her out of the brothel back then. Now that she and Shi Chanli were both older, it seemed that it was time to consider these things. As Fan Xian thought this, he crumpled the letter in his hand into snowflakes. Tilting his head, he sat in the chair in a daze. He had calculated the power in his hands many times, but he had never thought about it as clearly as he did today. The Overwatch Council and the Palace Treasury were naturally the 2 most powerful weapons in his hands. If the Emperor sent down an edict, he estimated that at most 20 to 30% of the people in the Overwatch Council would stand firmly behind Fan Xian. That lump of ice will probably stand in the middle. He will certainly not disobey the edict, but he shouldn't act against me either. Fan Xian silently thought about whether or not his friendship with Yan Bingyun would be able to stand the test of time in the future. Immediately after, he thought to himself, in the entire Overwatch Council, of the 1st Bureau, 3rd Bureau and 4th Bureau, his control was the strongest. The only people who could truly follow him through mountains of knives and seas of fire were the people of the Qinian unit. Fan Xian had begun to tamper with the palace treasury a few years ago. He believed that if the situation changed in the future, he would certainly have a way to make a powerful response. The palace treasury was a divine weapon that Fan Xian could use to fight against the might of heaven. Shi Chanli and Su Wenmao's loyalty was definitely trustworthy. Additionally, there was Deng Ziyu who was now in Xilyang. Fan Xian suddenly realized that the power in his hands was indeed very strong. Furthermore, there were faint signs that it was about to break away from the emperor's control. No wonder the emperor had begun to experiment with the future arrangements of court politics. A glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. He thought that in the end the emperor still had not discovered the most important point. He would go fight him the day after tomorrow and confirm and protect the power in his hands. He should be able to hold out for a few more years. Just as he and Haitang had once said, this world was those old people's and also theirs. In the end it would always be theirs. All they needed was time. One day at the end of April, the spring flowers had not been destroyed by the heat and wind. Instead, they were scattered to the ground by a sudden spring rain. The flowering trees that stretched out from the courtyards on the long streets in the south of Jingdo watched helplessly as their clothes were torn into shreds by the seemingly gentle but actually merciless spring wind. They fell to the stone ground outside the courtyard walls and were stepped on by hurrying pedestrians. They sank deep into the mud, revealing only the pink edges. The manor of the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, was on the main street in the south of the city. Not far behind this manor was the Jingdo Yamen. However, the hall of the Yamen was on the other side. The peace of power and wealth depended on each other but did not interfere with each other. Today was not Sun Jingxiu's birthday. Rather, it was his old mother's 80th birthday. It was indeed an important day. What Fan Ruoruo said the day before yesterday was that she had misheard. The old matriarch of the Sun Manor was also someone with a title. Sun Jingxiu rarely did anything, so when the various invitations were sent out, the officials would always come and entertain him. Although there were no red ribbons and colored lanterns hanging outside the Sun Manor's door, they had purposely added a sense of celebration. There were many people coming and going with gifts, but not many carriages came. On the long street, the housekeepers and servants only delivered the gift lists and boxes into the manor as usual. After saying a few words of apology on behalf of their masters, they left the Sun Manor. Some of the lower-ranking officials who did not know the inside story couldn't help but feel surprised when they saw this scene. They thought that the birthday of the Jingdo magistrate shouldn't be so deserted. It was a far cry from the bustling scene of the manors of other nobles. The Jingdo government was in charge of the safety of the entire Jingdo people. The people they dealt with were mostly the various yamens, various manors, nobles and various officials. Thus, it was difficult for the Jingdo government to do their jobs. However, the Jingdo government's status was also high. When the second prince fought for the throne, he had put a lot of effort into the Jingdo government. Normally speaking, no official would not give the Jingdo government face. Today's scene was indeed a little surprising. The people around the corner door were whispering among themselves. No one knew what they were discussing. However, they occasionally thought of the rumors of the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, in officialdom and felt that this was a natural thing. Sun Jingxiu was, without question, the luckiest person in the entire Qing officialdom. He was not a proper jurin. Rather, he was a scribe. From the moment he became an official, he had been doing administrative work in the Jingdo government. He had been doing this for half his life. Given his background and lack of background in such an important place, even if he worked for 3 lifetimes, he probably wouldn't be able to rise to the position of Jingdo magistrate. However, during these 6 or 7 years in the Qing kingdom, the crown prince and second prince fought for the throne. After Sir Fan Jr. entered the capital, there were chaotic battles. The Jingdo government, which was in an important place, became the most important place for the various powers to fight over. The Jingdo magistrate was not like the governors of the various roads. The various magistrates were far away from the emperor, so they could protect themselves and not lean toward any prince. The government was in Jingdo, so no power would let them go. The Jingdo magistrate had to make his stance clear. Thus, Mei Zhili was forced away, and the Jingdo magistrate that the second prince had helped into power was forced down. In a short 5 or 6 years, a number of Jingdo magistrates had fallen. No official had the courage to forcefully ask for this position. Thus, Sun Jingxiu, the of the Jingdo government, coincidentally sat in the position of the Jingdo magistrate. In the past, the Jingdo magistrate also held the position of a scholar in court. However, after Mei Zhili this rule became chaotic. By Sun Jingxiu's time, he was a bachelor Jingdo magistrate without any title of nobility. Thus, in officialdom, the officials all carried a glimmer of jealousy and disdain in their comments. Sun Jingxiu was the luckiest Jingdo magistrate in history, but he was also the Jingdo magistrate with the least power. Who knew when he would be kicked off the stage? However, Sun Jingxiu had his strong points. His long years of paperwork made him not good at interacting with officials. He was also not used to sucking up to the scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He threw himself wholeheartedly into state affairs. His conduct was honest and serious. He never took the rumors outside to heart. It was this kind of personality that made him, who had not seen the so-called emperor's posthumous edict in the autumn of the 7th year of the Qing calendar, accept the Empress Dowager's edict and do his best to put Fan Xian on the wanted list in Jingdo. The affairs of the world were difficult to predict. Who knew that the emperor had not died? Who knew that Sir Fan Jr. was a loyal official? Each time he thought of this, Sun Jingxiu couldn't help but feel a lingering fear. It was fortunate that he had raised a good girl, which allowed him to find a backer in court for the first time. Furthermore, it was the highest backer in court. Thus, the officials became even more jealous. The rumors of him selling his daughter for glory spread for a long time before they finally died down under Fan Xian's powerful suppression. 3 years had passed. The officials found that the connection between the Fan Manor and the Jingdo government was not close. Only then did they believe that the legend in the boudoir was only a legend. There was no follow-up story. It was because they believed that Sir Fan Jr. and the Jingdo government did not have any relationship between a man and a woman that the front door of the Sun Manor appeared so cold and cheerless. It was even more cheerless than the flowering trees by the side of the street. The housekeepers from the various manors who had given their gifts left the Sun Manor but did not leave the south of the city. Instead, they cleverly chose a tea house at the end of the street to rest for the time being. It was not even noon yet, but this luxuriously decorated tea house was already bustling with noise and excitement. The stewards who were familiar with each other greeted each other with a smile and invited each other to sit in the middle of the table. In a short while, half of the tea house was filled. The smiles of the housekeepers were strange. They all revealed a tacit understanding and a faint disdain toward the Jingdo government. The masters of these housekeepers were either officials of the 6 ministries or officials of the 3 temples. Some were nobles from the Duke's Alley. Today they only sent gifts, but they did not come in person. The fact that these housekeepers were gathered in the tea house and did not immediately return to the manor to report on the completion of the mission meant that these nobles and officials knew very well what the Sun Manor's birthday celebration represented. Sun Jingxiu was muddle-headed. This was the common thought of all the civil and military officials. Since Scholar He of the Hall of Governmental Affairs had already leaked the news, it was the person in the palace who had the idea. You still don't dare to immediately resign, yet you still want to hold a birthday celebration at this time? Do you want to see the palace's attitude? Do you want to see the rumors in officialdom? Or do you want to see something? However, these nobles and officials did not want to take things too far, so they had the housekeepers keep watch near the Sun Manor after they gave the gifts. They didn't know what exactly would happen. More accurately speaking, they were still a bit afraid of whether the rumor that had been quiet for almost 2 years was true or not. They didn't know whether or not the Duke of Danbo would personally come. Logically speaking, given Fan Xian's identity, the Jingdo government's business should not disturb him. However, the officials were all cunning people, so they still needed to make a final confirmation. Whose family sedan chair is that? A housekeeper who was talking about romance suddenly narrowed his eyes and saw a large sedan chair pass by the door of the Sun Manor. Looking at the number of people and the decorations on the curtains, it should not be of a low rank. The matter of the Jingdo magistrate changing was still in the rumor stage. All of the officials knew that this was the first time the popular He Zhongwei, with the emperor's support, had independently completed a highly influential personnel change. Thus, the officials of the various departments cleverly stood behind He Zhongwei. No one would stand in front of Sir He at this time. Today's birthday banquet was a good time to pick a side. Everyone wanted to get closer to the young and gentle Scholar He. Thus, the entrance to the Sun Manor was cold and cheerless. At this time, a rather eye-catching sedan stopped at the entrance to the Sun Manor. The housekeeper of the assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments laughingly scolded, "It's probably some manor that doesn't participate in politics." The assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments had a good relationship with He Zhongwei and knew the inside story of this matter. Thus, he had never thought of coming. Even this housekeeper's tone was slightly mocking. Unexpectedly, a housekeeper shook his head and said, "Something's not right. It looks like Duke Lu's manor." After these words were said, the housekeepers who had come from the Duke's Alley to deliver gifts quickly walked to the side of the railing. They looked for a moment and their expressions gradually changed. However, they didn't say anything to the people beside them. They met each other's eyes nervously. Taking advantage of the fact that the other housekeepers had not reacted, they sneakily slipped down the stairs. The other housekeepers in the tea house did not notice the commotion. They were just curious. Why would Duke Lu, who never participated in politics, lower himself to give the Sun family face? Immediately after, another large sedan chair slowly came from the north of the city and landed in front of the Sun Manor's door. From a distance, it could be seen that the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, had just received the duke into his manor. At this moment he was crawling out again. He was so shocked that he was about to fall to the ground. A housekeeper in the tea house cried out in a sharp voice, "It's old Prince Jing." As soon as these words came out, a strange and quiet atmosphere enveloped the tea house that was previously very chaotic. All the stewards stopped talking and began to quickly calculate in their minds, trying to guess what this shocking scene in front of them meant. Some of the smarter people had already connected Duke Lu and King Jing, two noble figures who would never appear in the Jingdo government, to another important figure. Their faces suddenly became deathly white as they quietly went down the tea house. The remaining housekeepers were still staring nervously at the door of the Sun Manor. It was as if they did not believe their eyes. They did not believe that Sun Jingxiu, this lonely old man, would be able to invite these two people to come out and help him. At this moment, two unremarkable black carriages drove steadily along the streets in the south of the city. They drove past the tea house and stopped in front of the Sun Manor's door. The black carriages were unremarkable and eye-piercing. The faces of everyone in the tea house all paled as they watched the young duke walk down from the carriage. Even more awkwardly, they watched the magnificently dressed princess slowly ascend the stairs with the duke's support. In an instant, the tea house became incomparably quiet. All the stewards rushed downstairs at lightning speed and rushed back to their own mansions. They had to notify their masters. Sir Fan Jr. had come, Princess Chen had come, King Jing had come, Duke Lu had come. Who are you? Hurry and go. Even if the Duke of Dambua only wanted to slap He Zhongwei's face, you still had to go and watch with a smile, no? For a moment, the manners of the officials in the south of Jingdo fell into chaos. Those who were looking for clothes looked for clothes, those who were sending messages sent messages, and those who were preparing new gifts prepared new gifts. But all the officials only had one goal, and that was the Sun residence. Most of the officials who had nothing to do with the matter faintly guessed why the little duke was going to the Sun Manor. Other than shock in their hearts, they couldn't help but feel a little excited. Jingdo had been peaceful for too long. It would be a good show to see how Sir Fan Jr. bullied the scholar and the officials of the various departments. Chapter 658. Lin Yichen, Best Female Lead, Fan Xian, Worst Male Lead, Me, Best Screenwriter. Thank you, everyone, for your hard work and support last month. I'm very happy, thank you very much. I won't be pretentious at all, I'm really happy. Because I didn't write much, I still managed to get so many votes in the end. Everyone did a much better job than me. Lao Wu has always been much more hardworking than me, so I'm already very happy to be ranked 4th. The difference isn't that big, it's all because of everyone's continuous support. Thank you very much. After I finished writing yesterday, I went straight to deliver food. Then, I almost forgot the shouting trick I learned from Liang Hechuan. I could only ask the leader from afar to do it. It felt good. I still can't write too much in the first few days of this month, I'm really sorry. Of course one day I'll try to work harder. I still have to continue canvassing votes. Brothers and sisters who have guaranteed monthly votes, if you want to spend it, please hurry up and do it. Thank you very much. Then, I thank myself because I know I'll work hard and seriously write my book this month, this year, next year, and most likely for the rest of my life. Because I really like writing. Then, I turn back to thank everyone again because I'm definitely going to get the few 103,000 word update votes yesterday. While laughing. Seriously speaking, I really don't want everyone to spend this money. In the past, I didn't think it was convenient to say it directly in the book, but today I can't help but say it. Don't vote for the update votes. No matter how small a mosquito is, it's still meat. A dollar has its uses. The money I get from subscriptions is my legitimate income, the monthly votes reward is everyone's encouragement, and the update votes reward is something I don't feel good about. I'll continue writing. Everyone knows me, I can last, I don't need the temptation of the update votes, although I don't write much every day. If you vote for 12,000 but I can't write it, then I won't get it. If you vote for 3,000 but I write smoothly, then I might be able to write an entire 20,000 word chapter. I understand that everyone is encouraging me, but it's fine to save some money, right? Chapter 659. The Qin Kingdom governed the world with filial piety. When the wise and brilliant emperor moved a large amount of silver from the national treasury to build a mausoleum for the dead Empress Dowager, the scholars Shu and Hu only expressed their worry on the surface. Fan Xian could not be bothered to pay attention to this matter. Sun Jingxiu was celebrating his mother's birthday, so it was much more important than his own. It was because of this matter that he had the courage to invite Fan Xian. When Sir Fan Jr. actually held Princess Chen's hand and stepped through the front door of the manor, Sun Jingxiu still found it difficult to suppress his excitement. His life these few months had been precarious. It seemed that in an instant all of the officials and yamens had begun to watch him. It made him feel like there was a thorn in his back and he could not rest easy. After thinking it over, he still thought it was Fan Xian. However, the Sun Manor and the Fan family did not actually have a deep connection, so he didn't know if it would work or not. It worked. Although Sun Jingxiu's lips tasted bitter and gloomy, and he felt a great deal of guilt toward his daughter, he looked at Fan Xian's handsome face and still bowed respectfully. He then welcomed the pair into the manor. The manor had long been properly arranged. All of the female guests were in the back garden. The people sitting in the front yard were all the main officials of the Jingdo government. The three halls, the front and back, that had been specially left open for the officials of the court, were currently empty and eye-piercing. Fan Xian followed Sun Jingxiu inside. Looking at the long empty tables, he couldn't resist smiling. Lin Wan quietly said something by his ear. Accompanied by the nannies and carefully served by the women of the Sun Manor, she walked toward the back garden. Turning to the west wing, Fan Xian followed Sun Jingxiu into the study. He already knew that King Jing and Duke Lu had already arrived. The two noble elders were currently chatting with Sir Sun's mother. At their age and seniority, they didn't pay much attention to etiquette. The study was very quiet. Fan Xian looked at Sun Jingxiu and said with a smile, "Sir Sun, you are truly not a smart person." Before the banquet began, Sun Jingxiu was afraid of neglecting Sir Fan Jr., so he personally accompanied him into the study. The servants had not yet brought the tea, but Fan Xian had already said these words calmly and directly. Sun Jingxiu's heart involuntarily jumped. For a moment he didn't know what to say. "I'm curious." Fan Xian looked at him and said in an even voice, "In the past you never used these methods to figure out the emperor's heart. Why are you doing the opposite this year? Why do you want to borrow my power to see what's happening in officialdom? I am surprised that you are not a person who cares about power and wealth." Sun Jingxiu was silent for a moment. He then raised his hands in respect and said, "Jingxiu thinks that I have been rather particular in being the Jingdo magistrate. Please take pity on me." Fan Xian gently knocked on the table as if he was thinking about the propriety of the situation. He had not expected Sun Jingxiu to make such a direct request. However, he also liked direct negotiations. A moment later, he nodded slightly and said, "I'll speak for you in the palace." "What about Lord He?" Sun Jingxiu was overjoyed, but he still maintained a calm expression as he asked in a trembling voice. Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly and said, "He is the imperial censor of the left. I can't control him." Sun Jingxiu was slightly shocked. Fan Xian raised his head and said with a slight smile, "However, he is only an advisor of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. If who the scholar doesn't nod his head, what can he do to you, the Jingdo magistrate?" The conversation in the study ended very quickly. Fan Xian did not have Sun Jingxiu spit out any mushy words in front of him. They both knew that since Fan Xian was willing to help Sun Jingxiu with such a large favor, Sun Jingxiu could only sell his life to Fan Xian. The Jingdo magistrate was not an idle position. When Sun Jingxiu glanced toward the officialdom, he could only see the back of Fan Xian's head. He had no other choice. Just as Fan Xian and Sun Jingxiu were chatting, the stewards and servants of the Sun Manor stared dumbfoundedly at the endless stream of official sedan chairs coming in from outside the manor. They looked at the famous people in court coming with smiles and warmth to offer birthday wishes. They couldn't help but wonder where these people had run off to earlier. A servant went into the study to notify him. Sun Jingxiu couldn't help smiling bitterly. He knew that the reason these people's attitudes had changed so quickly was all because Sir Fan Jr. had personally come. Furthermore, he had asked King Jing and Duke Lu to be the axes. Fan Xian saw the bitterness in his heart and said with a smile, "The matters of officialdom are just this shameless. You've endured in the Jingdo government for so long. You should get used to it. Otherwise, how many more years can you endure if you're always sulking?" Sun Jingxiu nodded his head in acknowledgement. There were only 3 tables set up in the main hall. The women were all arranged thoughtfully in the back garden. Fan Xian only followed Wan'er to chat with old Sun Matriarch for a bit before retreating. The main seat in the middle of the banquet was temporarily empty. Naturally, King Jing unceremoniously sat in the most honorable seat. High Duke Lu, on the other hand, sat diagonally across from him in the number 2 seat. The two elders had known each other their entire lives. Although they sat a little far from each other, their voices were loud when they spoke. It was as if a casual conversation had turned into an argument. As usual, King Jing's mouth was full of filthy language. With each sentence he would bring in a few words. It made the officials at the three tables in the hall uncomfortable. Unfortunately, High Duke Lu was someone who had retired from the army, so he was familiar with this routine. Sun Jingxiu was entertaining the other officials. Fan Xian sat between King Jing and Duke Lu, smiling, chatting and eating and drinking with them. He was at ease. King Jing and the Fan Manor were old friends, so their friendship did not need to be mentioned. Duke Lu was Lady Lu's biological father. On the surface he was Fan Xian's maternal grandfather, so Fan Xian was incomparably respectful. He talked with Duke Lu about the matters in Danzhou. Lady Lu was doing very well. As a maternal grandfather he was at ease. Additionally, with Fan Xian looking after them, the children and grandchildren in the Duke's Alley all had their own piece of land. Chatting with King Jing was a bit of a headache. This old man would vaguely bring up matters like the medical shop in just a few sentences. Fan Xian sighed quietly in his heart. He didn't know if there was a possibility between Hongqing and Ruoruo. Speaking of Crown Prince Li Hongqing after the new year as the general of Dingzhou, he could not always stay in Jingdou fighting with the scholar. He had no choice but to return to the west. However, he left a group of personal guards outside the Danbo medical shop to keep an eye on it day in and day out. The emperor knew he was messing around and was also very angry, but there was nothing he could do. The guests gradually all arrived. 3 ministers, 2 officials, 7 or 8 vice ministers, and more than half of the important officials in the Qing court had come. Given the Jingdou magistrate's reputation, he could not bring in so many important figures. However, Fan Xian's reputation had this kind of killing power. As time passed, Fan Xian began to have a headache. These ministers and vice ministers came to greet him. Naturally, he had to rise to greet them and accept their considerate greetings. Seeing that the 3 tables of people had come down, they were also a bit tired. However, this was not the end. There were still many officials in the outer courtyard who took turns coming in to greet him. They did not want to pass up this rare opportunity to see Sir Fan Jr. After one round, the entire hall floated with the sound of flattery. Fan Xian's expression changed several times as he was flattered by dozens of officials. The feeling of being flattered by dozens of officials was not a good one. After 3 rounds of drinking, another official began to mention Fan Xian's extraordinary service in Dongyi. Everyone's gazes looking at him became heated. At this moment, not many people cared about the scholar He Zongwei. After all, this little duke was the emperor's own son. Furthermore, he had done so much for the Qing kingdom these years. He was truly an extremely popular figure. What could the ruling class do? It was not impossible for him to split the land and be made a king. Fan Xian's head hurt. He wondered if these officials had come to wish the old matriarch of the Sun Manor a birthday or had they come specially to flatter him. When all was said and done, he understood. If they had not come specially to flatter him, why would these officials come? It was clear that King Jing was also very interested in the Dongyi matter. He pulled him to his side and asked in detail about some confidential matters. However, it would take at least half a year to finish negotiating the treaty, so Fan Xian could not say anything. He only picked some unimportant matters and secretly told them to the old gardener. The low-ranking officials didn't have to care about fawning, but the ministers and vice ministers sitting in the main hall still had to put on a calm expression. They only occasionally swept their gazes over Fan Xian's face. Fan Xian turned a blind eye to them. He knew these people were waiting for him to explode and then they would see how he would deal with the subsequent matters. The sun gradually moved and the noise of drinking outside also stopped. After drinking a few cups of wine, King Jing and High Duke Lu felt that their heads were a little heavy and their bodies were a little tired. They didn't want to see what was going to happen next, so they found an excuse to leave. Sun Jingxiu respectfully saw the 2 nobles out of the main door before returning to the main hall. After thinking for a moment, he ordered the servants to stand guard outside the main hall and pay attention to any activity. He stepped in and apologized to the officials at the 3 tables in the hall. He chuckled and chatted idly. After declining for a while, he finally sat back down in the main seat at the head of the table. The main hall gradually quieted down. Everyone unconsciously stopped and put down their cups. Looking at the various dishes in front of them, they used peaceful smiles on their faces to show their official manner and breadth of mind as they waited for what would happen next. First, Sun Jingxiu sincerely expressed his thanks and so on. Then he also closed his mouth and sat by Fan Xian's side. He was very calm. Fan Xian's eyelids drooped slightly. He slowly put down the chopsticks in his hand. The ivory chopsticks landed on the green porcelain chopsticks pillow and made a light clinking sound. All of the officials' hearts were struck by this sound. There was an uncomfortable silence. The entire main hall was quiet. Compared to the liveliness in the courtyard and the music from the back garden, it was extremely quiet. I will not say more about Sir Sun's official reputation. Fan Xian raised his head and gently opened his thin lips. The emperor also has many words of praise and encouragement in private. Hearing these words, the officials at the banquet felt it was quite ironic. If the emperor truly liked this Jingdo magistrate, how could Sir he have let out that rumor? However, the duke said in private? Who would know what the father and son said in private? Would these people at the banquet dare to ask something in front of the emperor's face? Everyone is an official in the same court. Everyone has times when things aren't going their way. I hope you can help each other out. Fan Xian's words were very lacking. First of all, he brought out Sun Jingxiu's predicament and put him at a disadvantage. Furthermore, he even brought out the words of helping a merchant. His table manners were a bit unsightly. However, things like standards always depended on the character. Even if the emperor wrote a limerick about a white dog swollen, the officials would still sing praises without restraint. After Fan Xian said this, all of the officials at the banquet stroked their beards and nodded. They deeply felt that Sir Fan Jr.'s words were simple but not simple. They were very reasonable. Fan Xian turned his head and looked at the official to his right. What does Minister Wei think? The present Minister of Revenue, Wei Donghang, was a crafty official who had been polished for a long time in the Ministry of Revenue. In the past few years, he had gone to the Fan Manor to discuss matters with Minister Fan and had met Fan Xian countless times. For him to be able to take over Fan Jian's position was not only because of his performance in the Ministry of Revenue. More accurately, it was because he had completely fallen to the emperor's side. He wholeheartedly followed the emperor's wishes and pulled the Ministry of Revenue out of the swamp of the Fan family's independent kingdom. Minister Wei knew that his actions these 2 years had offended Sir Fan Jr. However, behind him was the emperor, so he was not too worried. During these 2 years, Fan Xian had not expressed any dissatisfaction toward him. It was as if he understood his difficulties. It was because of this that he knew of Fan Xian's arrival when the Sun Manor was hosting. After thinking for a long time, he still came. He had not expected that Sir Fan Jr. would actually choose to make things difficult for the Jingdo government and pick him first. His heart jumped slightly. He knew that Sir Fan Jr. did not like him. Otherwise, he would not have picked the Ministry of Revenue to be the first to attack. A faint coldness surged into his heart. However, Minister Wei had no other choice. After thinking for a moment, he smiled evenly and said, "What the Duke says is reasonable. The Ministry of Revenue acts according to the edict and Qing law. It would not act recklessly." Everyone at the banquet was a wily old fox who had risen and fallen in officialdom for a long time. They knew why Fan Xian had picked Minister Wei out to ask him alone. However, this matter did not concern them, so they had to let it go. They had not expected that Minister Wei's light words would push Fan Xian back. There was not even a vague promise of goodwill. The officials admired Minister Wei's courage. They were also worried about what would happen next. They all remained silent. The other 2 ministers raised their chopsticks and quietly indicated for the officials beside them to slowly eat. "I am a very peaceful person." The smile on Fan Xian's face grew brighter and brighter. Staring into Wei Donghang's eyes, he said evenly, "If there is an edict, I will act according to it. If there is no edict, I would like to see what will happen to those lowly people in the end." The Overwatch Council and the affairs of the court were 2 different things. They did not interfere with each other. Fan Xian's words had already crossed the taboo. The words "lowly people" had, without a doubt, shaved Minister Wei's face clean off. His expression immediately became icy. Looking at Fan Xian, he said, "What do you mean by this?" Fan Xian still did not get angry. He only smiled and said, "Nothing. I am just going into the palace tonight to ask the emperor what edict he has recently given the Ministry of Revenue for the Ministry of Revenue Yamen to not do their proper work and instead wait in the Jingdo government every day. I control the Overwatch Council, but I do not dare to privately investigate 3rd-level officials and above." Fan Xian's expression remained warm. Today is the old matriarch's 70th birthday, so I should not say such cold words that spoil the mood. However, I won't be able to stay in the capital for long. I am about to go to Dongyi. I also thought that the Jingdo government is an important matter, so I was in too much of a rush. Everyone, please don't laugh. The officials at the banquet all laughed dryly. No one dared to actually laugh. Sir Fan Jr.'s words had clearly reminded them that he was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. In 3 days he would officially become the second director of the Qin Kingdom's Overwatch Council. As for his other identities, there was no need to mention them. Return to Dongyi? This was another reminder to the officials that Fan Xian had enough merit to ask the emperor for something, even if it was an edict. Minister Wei's heart jumped. He understood the meaning in these 2 sentences. Fan Xian raised a cup of wine and said to the officials at the banquet, "Everyone let the Jingdo government be quieter." With these words, everyone knew that Fan Xian had officially stood out. After an awkward silence, people slowly raised the wine cups in front of them. It was uneven, but basically all of the officials raised their cups. Minister Wei was still staring at the wine cup in front of him in a daze. He was indeed in a difficult position. He knew that Fan Xian was a very vengeful person. Furthermore, he had smiled so warmly earlier. He was probably extremely angry in his heart. Even if he begged for mercy and took a step back, would Fan Xian let him go in the future? Furthermore, he was, after all, a minister of a court. His position was respectable, and he had the full support of the emperor in his own way. If he gave in like this, it would be difficult to justify. Fan Xian didn't look him in the eye. He smiled warmly and said, "Although we are all officials in court, we are all pitiful people. We all want to create a good future for our children, grandchildren, and relatives." The emperor once said that in life, one must have a heart of reverence. He looked at the people at the banquet and warmly said, "As I walk between heaven and earth, I only have a heart of reverence for 2 things. The minister of the Board of Rights furrowed his brows slightly. He had been the first person to raise his cup earlier. He was different from Minister Wei. He had not offended the Fan manor, so he had a chance to make amends. Furthermore, he silently mocked Wei Dongxing for not knowing what kind of person Sir Fan Jr. was and what tricks he had. He knew what Minister Wei was thinking. The Overwatch Council could not control officials above the 3rd level. As long as the emperor did not speak, it seemed that Sir Fan Jr. could not threaten him at all. However, he knew that Minister Wei seemed to have forgotten history. When Fan Xian was still a commoner, he had sent the original minister of the Board of Rights, Guiyu, to his death. Later he had destroyed countless ministers. This was a ruthless person who dared to force the crown prince to his death. Why would you, a mere minister, clash head-on with him? Thinking of this, the minister of the Board of Rights followed Fan Xian's words and asked with a smile, "What is your reverence for?" "I first salute the emperor and second salute my parents." Fan Xian gently spun the little wine cup between his fingers and smiled. "The emperor speaks well. Without a heart of reverence, one's actions will tend to be impetuous. In the past, my actions have been impetuous. Please, everyone, forgive me." There was another wave of laughter at the banquet. Everyone heard the meaning of these words clearly. Reverence? The Duke was clearly telling everyone that other than heaven and earth, parents and the emperor, in their reverence, they should not forget themselves. Impetuous? This Duke's actions were not only impetuous, they were sinister and ruthless. It was still that old saying. It was a very low-level threat. Because the person making the threat was too powerful, it appeared powerful. In particular, Fan Xian's earlier mention of children and relatives finally reminded some people that even if the Overwatch Council could not touch the ministers and vice-ministers, it was an easy matter to send the rest of the people and their families to hell. This was a very arrogant, and impudent action. However, the emperor favored and trusted Fan Xian. No one could change this reality. Wei Dongxing's expression gradually darkened. His fingers also began to tremble. He felt that Sir Fan Jr. was too unreasonable. Did he dare to act against his own family because of his own matters? Everyone knew that Fan Xian dared. Although Sir Fan Jr. had the title of an immortal poet, he had always walked the dark and ghostly path and was used to being unreasonable. In the end, Wei Dongxing slowly raised his wine cup and drained it in one gulp. He didn't know the taste of the wine. Fan Xian nodded and raised his wine cup again. He said one last thing, "Everyone eat and drink well." He didn't know if the remaining officials, particularly the Minister of Revenue who had been openly threatened and disdained by Fan Xian, were in the mood to eat and drink well. In any case, Fan Xian was in a good mood. He left the Sun Manor early and didn't go home with Lin Wanner. Instead, he sat in the black carriage and headed toward the north of the city. To the Imperial College, he ordered Mu Fenger. Who the scholar is not on duty today? He is giving a lecture in the Imperial College. Mu Fenger made a sound of acknowledgement and didn't think about why he was in such a rush to see who the scholar. Fan Xian rubbed the slightly tightened space between his brows in the carriage. His actions in the Sun manner were not appropriate, but he had to put on such an attitude. Such an attitude would immediately spread throughout Jingdo, so he had to be at the very front to deal with the follow-up matters. He was going to enter the palace at night. Before entering the palace he had to see who the scholar. If he could convince this leading scholar, then he would have more confidence in challenging the emperor. Chapter 660. The black carriage passed by the intersection of Dongchuan. Fan Xian had just pulled back his gaze from his bookstore and medical shop. Turning his head, he saw the ancient, overflowing doors of the Imperial College. The Imperial College was a rather sparsely built group of buildings. There were no buildings such as yamen or halls facing the street, and there were no tall courtyard walls. Even the main gate had never been closed. The green trees inside poked out, and the sounds of reading could be heard everywhere. It was full of the quiet and peaceful atmosphere of Confucianism. Just as the Bureau of Military Affairs had once been called the Ministry of Military Affairs, the old Ministry of Military Affairs was still mixed in with the Ministry of War of the Six Ministries. The Qing Kingdom had played with a number of new policies over the past few decades, and they had changed the name of the Imperial College again and again. Tungguan Library Institute of Education. Whatever was difficult to say, the emperor had randomly changed it. However, the scholars of the world were still used to calling this area the Imperial College. Later, the official documents of the court naturally acknowledged this. The scholars selected by each province, as well as the outstanding children pushed out by the manners of the nobility in Jingdo, were all gathered in this group of buildings to study classics, history, and the ways of governance. This was the highest school in the Qing Kingdom, so the teachers they invited were also the best of the best. For example, Sir Pan Ling, who had already become a master calligrapher in the palace, and Tseng Wenxiang, the teacher of He Zongwei, a scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. A few years ago, Xu the scholar had also been a professor at the Imperial College. Now, the #1 Chinese official in the court, Hu the scholar, also often came to the Imperial College to teach these scholars. With so many arrogant teachers, in addition to the special status of the Imperial College, the students inside already had a very good future. So, the students of the Imperial College could not help but be arrogant. Normal government offices did not want to interact with the Imperial College, and the Qing Kingdom's slightly more liberal style of learning made it even more difficult for normal officials to casually go in. They were very afraid of being interrogated by these students and then fleeing in a sorry state. However, Fan Xian had never had such worries. His relationship with the students of the Imperial College had always been good. Particularly after the 4th year of the Qing calendar, he held a position in the Imperial College and served as the assistant of the nominal head of the Imperial College. Later, Fan Xian's talent shocked the world and he dragged a carriage full of Master Zhuang's books from northern Qi back to the Imperial College. His position in the Imperial College became incomparably high, and he was deeply respected by the students. The carriage quietly stopped at the gate of the Imperial College. An official had already come to receive them. Fan Xian got off the carriage and raised his head to look at the large door he hadn't seen in half a year. He smiled. This simple and unadorned door had actually been built later. It had forcefully rubbed in a bit of antiquity. Spending so much silver was actually because the Qing Kingdom always had a deep sense of inferiority when it came to learning, particularly in certain corners related to history. The sky suddenly began to rain. Although it was not heavy, the scattered raindrops fell on the dark wooden door of the Imperial College, making it particularly eye-catching. The mottled spots gradually became a blur, and the stone slabs on the ground were about to accumulate water. An official from the Qinian unit silently took out a robe from the carriage and wanted to help him put it on. Fan Xian shook his head. Although he liked to wear black robes and bring his closest subordinates in a triangular formation and move out like a ghost in Jingdo's quiet autumn night, he didn't want to appear too special and startle the hot-blooded and pure students. Mu Feng held up an umbrella and sent him through the gates of the Imperial College. It was already afternoon. The sun had already moved west. Now it was covered by clouds and swept away by the dark rain. The light became even dimmer. The spacious courtyard was filled with a sense of seclusion. Walking forward under the green trees, he didn't see a single person. It was extremely empty and quiet. Thousands of Imperial College students were still in class. As a professor, Fan Xian counted clearly. However, he furrowed his brows and thought, why did the sound of reading stop so uniformly? Like a swarm of bees suddenly moving together or like a mountain wind pouring into a narrow natural stone kettle, a buzzing sound suddenly rang out in the quiet courtyard of the Imperial College. The sound grew closer and louder. It was the sound of countless people talking and laughing mixed together. Class ended. Hundreds of young scholars walked out of the various courtyards of the Imperial College at the same time and walked to the wide path in the center. They were densely packed and squeezed together. A wave of fresh energy immediately filled the entire space. Some of the young people had forgotten to bring umbrellas. They cried out loudly and jumped on the wet stone pavement. Breaking through the layers of rain, they ran toward their own dorms. Most of the students were calm and unruffled in the midst of chaos. With calm smiles, they opened the umbrellas beside them. For a moment, the entire courtyard was filled with countless umbrellas of all different colors. However, there were no bright colors. Most of them were light green and gray. Thus, Fan Xian, who originally didn't want to stand out, became a strange plant in the sea of pale umbrellas because of the large black umbrella above his head. He immediately attracted everyone's attention. Sir Fan Jr. Teacher. Sir. The students surrounded him in pleasant surprise and bowed to Fan Xian. Most of the students had only seen his appearance from a distance. Some had been fortunate enough to have followed him to edit Master Zhuang's classics and history books, so they shouted with particular strength. Fortunately, there was no congestion. These students probably knew that Fan Xian was busy with official business in court and had recently been busy with important matters in Dongyi. Thus they all suppressed the joy in their hearts. After bowing and greeting him, they made way for the middle path. Fan Xian smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. He then chatted a bit with familiar students and teachers before raising his head to look at the color of the sky. He didn't dare tarry any longer. Excusing himself, he walked toward the depths of Jingxi Courtyard. Behind him and the Overwatch Council officials, the students of the Imperial College still found it difficult to suppress their excitement. They whispered curiously among themselves. They were all guessing why Sir Fan Jr. had come to the Imperial College today. Would the Emperor return Sir Fan Jr. to the Imperial College just because of the Dongyi matter? Would he be allowed to continue teaching? Fan Xian closed the black umbrella and placed it by the door. A stream of cool rainwater flowed down the tip of the umbrella and wrote a large character, drenching the tall wooden doorframe. Fan Xian accepted the towel the teacher handed him and carelessly wiped his slightly wet hair. He then entered the inner room and bowed to the scholar behind the desk. With a smile he said, "I've come to see you." The scholar took off the glasses on his nose and looked at him suspiciously for a while before recognizing him. He smiled and said, "It's rare that I don't have to stay in the corner room today. I was just thinking about some peace and quiet. Can't you give me some time to relax?" Presently, the Hall of Governmental Affairs was headed by the scholar. The Emperor was, after all, gradually getting older. His energy was not as great as when he was in his prime. Furthermore, the Emperor seemed to have thought things through and had thrown many political matters to the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He no longer had to attend to everything personally. In this way, the power of the Hall of Governmental Affairs was greater, but its affairs were incredibly busy. Using the private words of some sharp-eyed officials, the present Hall of Governmental Affairs was gradually becoming the Prime Minister's manor of the past. The power in the hands of the head scholar, the scholar, also seemed to be moving closer and closer to that of the past Lin Ruofu. Fan Xian didn't believe this. Since the Emperor had, with great difficulty, pulled his father-in-law off the stage, he would not allow another Lin Ruofu to appear. However, he also knew that the scholar worked hard on political matters all day and was indeed very tired. Smiling, he went forward and bowed again. "If it wasn't serious business, I wouldn't have come to bother you." The scholar had a good relationship with him. One reason was that in the debate between the old and the new, the two of them were on the same side. Both sides admired each other's temperament, so they had formed a good personal relationship. Another reason was that during the Jingdo Rebellion, the scholar had helped Fan Xian greatly. In the end, Fan Xian had been the first to save his life. "Speak." The scholar placed the glasses on the table with a light click. After a slight pause, he sighed and said, "For you to personally go, I don't think it will be a good thing." Fan Xian smiled and looked at the glasses on the table. He didn't immediately speak of his purpose of coming. Instead he said, "Are these crystal glasses still useful?" Just like in the past, the scholar had a youthful appearance that did not match his age at all. However, Fan Xian knew that there was a small problem with the eyes of this head of civil officials. 2 years ago they had occasionally talked about it and Fan Xian had remembered it. He had the palace treasury ponder it for a long time. In the end, they had found a foreign crystal from Dongyi and made a pair of unique glasses for him. The scholar had always been grateful for this matter. Day and night, he worked on government affairs and examined memorials. If his eyes were not good, it would be a big problem. However, it was hand-ground and there was no optometry machine. Fan Xian only knew that Hu the scholar had presbyopia. He didn't know how much help it would be. Very good, Hu the scholar said with a smile. Hu the scholar smiled and said, fine, just based on this bespectacled boy's affection, I will do whatever you want. In any case, the little duke will not have me do anything stupid that goes against the law and goes against the edict. After these words were said, Fan Xian was speechless and almost broke into laughter. He thought that this scholar appeared righteous, but he was actually so cautious and cunning. The two of them knew that, given Fan Xian's abilities, if there was a problem he could not handle himself, it had to be a problem within the court. Hu the scholar's words were extremely cunning. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. Just as Hu the scholar thought that it would be difficult for him to speak and was stroking his beard to comfort himself, he suddenly narrowed his eyes and said, the Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, is a pretty good official. Hu the scholar's fingers tightened and almost pulled out his beard. He coughed repeatedly. He truly had not expected Fan Xian to speak so directly. Concerning the position of the Jingdo magistrate as the leader of the civil officials, he knew the cause of the current situation. However, the emperor was currently supporting his own way to the position, so as a scholar, he could only maintain his silence. He glanced at Fan Xian probingly and said, Sir Sun, was it not the duke who personally suppressed the rumors back then? Fan Xian couldn't be bothered to beat around the bush with him. He directly sat down beside him and moved close to his ear. I have nothing to do with his daughter, but I do want to protect Sir Sunday. This is the emperor's intention. Hu the scholar did not hold back on anything in front of him and directly brought up the emperor. Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, it is just that his own way is dancing there in a youthful and moving manner. What does that have to do with the emperor? Hu the scholar smiled. He knew that in front of anyone, this kid would not admit that the problem with the Jingdo government was the emperor's intention. Otherwise he would be openly challenging the emperor. Fan Xian continued, I only ask one thing. How exactly was Sun Jingxiu's performance these 3 years? This. Hu the scholar gently stroked his short beard. After a moment of silence he said, above average for 2 years and average for 1 year. It was nothing more than average. The Jingdo government was indeed an important position. Thus, Hu the scholar firmly remembered the performance of the 3 years and blurted it out. Fan Xian laughed coldly and said, don't say these blind words. The scholar knows in his heart that the position of Jingdo magistrate is not for people. If you don't offend this manner, then you offend that department. Year after year you fail every year. Back then Mei Zhili was at most average. Fan Xian rubbed his wrist and said, Sun Jingxiu had 2 years of being above average. He was already an extraordinary and capable official. Additionally, this person was not good at forming factions and cheating. For him to have such an evaluation is truly rare. Hu the scholar was silent for a moment. In the end he could not defeat his own conscience and principles. Gently he nodded his head. He knew that the position of the Jingdo magistrate was difficult to handle. Sun Jingxiu was truly a rare subordinate. If he continued to be in charge of the Jingdo government, it would be much easier for him as a scholar to handle matters. If he is truly removed, who will replace him? Fan Xian said seriously. I have not come today for personal feelings or to fight. I just want to ask, does the scholar want to see the Jingdo government change through another 5 magistrates in the next 3 years and, in the end, cause such a ruckus that no one will dare to come and even play the trick of eating coal and getting sick? Hu the scholar sighed and said awkwardly, I also don't want Sir Sun to leave. However, I still don't understand why there would be rumors of this coming from the palace. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and quietly asked, did you and that person quarrel again? In this world, the only person who dared to quarrel with the emperor was Fan Xian. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and said, it has nothing to do with quarreling. You should also see clearly that the emperor is using this matter to establish his own way's might. Not to mention that Sun Jingxiu is now my man, even if he was an idiot I would still protect him. Earlier you said it was not personal feelings. Now he's your man again. Hu the scholar smiled bitterly and shook his head. What do you want me to do? If I appear, the emperor will certainly guess that I was asked by you. Sir, he is also a talented person. Why do you have to be angry at him? Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then quietly said, this anger must be dealt with. In this world, if the east wind does not overwhelm the west wind, then the west wind will overwhelm the east wind. I will not give his own way a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of possibility, a sliver of luck, or a successful history. What? Hu the scholar saw the seriousness in his words and felt slightly startled. Fan Xian didn't answer this question because it involved him doing his best to hold on to the power in his hands under the emperor's pressure and make an announcement. He slowly stood and said, "Tonight, I am going to the palace to quarrel and force the emperor not to issue an edict. Thus, the Jingdo government's problem is the pressure of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. I need you to help me resist it." Hu the scholar didn't reply. It was as if he was waiting for his explanation. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "Sun Jingxiu is a decent official. He shouldn't disappear in the senseless struggle for power. The reason is actually that simple." Without waiting for Hu the scholar to speak, he faintly said, "The Imperial College is a decent place. It is full of youthful energy. These students will all enter the court to become officials. As teachers, not only do we have to teach them something, we also have to use the true situation in court to help them build up some confidence. As long as an official is willing to do things, he will be safe and sound." Fan Xian stared into Hu the scholar's eyes. "If Sun Jingxiu collapses like this, what will you teach these students? What use will the standards in the scholar's books have?" Forced into a corner by Fan Xian, Hu the scholar was silent for a long time. He knew that this little duke was someone who would do what he said. If he didn't agree, he might actually use his prestige in the Imperial College to incite the students to do something. He couldn't help but sigh and say, "Fine, as long as the emperor does not issue an edict, I will protect Sir Sunday." Hearing these words, Fan Xian finally smiled happily and raised his hands in a salute. Without saying anything more, he bid farewell and left. Hu the scholar picked up the crystal spectacles on the table and said with a smile, "Even if it's to return the favor for these spectacles, don't you think I'm returning the favor a bit too much?" Fan Xian was in a good mood. "At worst, I'll have the palace treasury make a few more pairs and give one to each of your young masters." Hu the scholar was secretly mocked by him and laughingly scolded, "What I mean is, the governor said a few days ago that when you finish with the Dongi matter, you have to hurry back to the Imperial College to teach the students." Fan Xian smiled and replied, "Even if you didn't say this, I was prepared to do it." These were sincere words. Entering the Imperial College and seeing so many young students, Fan Xian was in a good mood. It was as if he thought of his previous life when he was in school. Furthermore, he knew that these students would certainly be the pillars of the Qing kingdom in the future. If he could influence them a little ahead of time at some point, perhaps this would be his life-saving talisman. Fan Xian bid farewell and left. Hu the scholar continued to do his own things alone under the dim company of the light. After an indeterminable amount of time, before the sky had completely darkened, an official quietly walked in and said something by his ear. Hu the scholar was silent for a long time. A bitter smile rose involuntarily to the corners of his lips. In a quiet voice he said, "So, something like this happened at the Sun Manor banquet? I really don't know what this little duke is thinking to make such a pompous fuss. It is completely unlike his usual reserved personality." The official was Hu the scholar's trusted aide. There was also a puzzled expression on his face. He said with confusion, "Furthermore, this matter is very strange. He clearly knows that it is the palace's intention, yet Sir Fan Jr. is still stubbornly resisting it and even begging teacher. For a mere Sun Jingxiu, is it worth it? It's not just Sun Jingxiu." Hu the scholar sighed again and waved his hand for the official to leave. He warned, "There's no need to bring this matter up again. As long as the emperor does not issue an edict, I will protect someone for Sir Fan Jr. It should be fine." The official acknowledged in a low voice and left after saying his goodbyes. Hu the scholar's still young face changed expression under the dim light. He was thinking about Fan Xian's words earlier and guessing at Fan Xian's true intentions. East wind and west wind? He rubbed his slightly tightened brows and couldn't resist smiling bitterly. Sir, he probably did not have the right to be the east wind. Sir Fan Jr. was fighting the emperor. But why was he fighting? Was it because he had a grudge against the emperor's action of reducing power and was venting it here? Hu the scholar sank into deep thought. He kept feeling that this was not the case. It had already been 3 years. The emperor's reduction of the Overwatch Council's power had continued to advance. Fan Xian always took a step back before the palace took another step forward. He followed suit and retreated without a trace of unwillingness. Why didn't Fan Xian retreat? Was he worried that if he retreated too much, he wouldn't have anything in his hands to contend with others? Other than the emperor, who did he need to contend with? Hu the scholar's brows were furrowed tightly. He could not understand this matter no matter what. Suddenly, his fingers touched his wrinkles. Startled, he quickly and slowly used his fingers to spread them apart. Then he quietly took out a small porcelain bottle from under the table. He picked out a small oily substance from the bottle and carefully smeared it on his face. After slowly patting it, the skin on his face became smoother. The few wrinkles were not eye-catching at all. The scholar put the porcelain bottle into the table and hid it well. He smiled self-mockingly. There was no need for him to think so much about the matters between the emperor and his son. It was not like they could truly turn hostile. Instead, it was his own face that made the self-mockery at the corners of the scholar's lips grow stronger. There was even a faint sorrow. He was not young, so he paid particular attention to the care of his face. He knew that his historical mission was to become the center of the emperor's court in 100 years, so he had to not appear old. If His Majesty thought that he was already old, he would definitely have other ideas and leave a younger minister to assist his son. Everyone had their own secrets, their own helplessness, and their own sorrow. Yesterday's chapter was liked by many people. I was pleasantly surprised. Today's chapter is one that I've liked recently. I don't have any sense of anxiety when writing it. I'm very satisfied. At the beginning of the month, I summoned the monthly votes to everyone. Last month, everyone has worked hard. I will continue to trouble you this month. Come vote for me. Chapter 661. 3 years ago the entire Jingdo was hunting me down. If it weren't for the help of the Sun family, it would have been difficult for me to live until now, much less transport the Black Knights into the capital. The atmosphere in the royal study was tense. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and looked at the emperor on the couch in front of him. His expression was slightly heavy as he slowly said each word. From this perspective, the Sun family can be considered my savior and a meritorious minister in quelling the rebellion. Quelling the rebellion? The emperor did not raise his head. The dim yellow light shone on his tightly bound hair. A few strands of white hair could faintly be seen reflected. He only continued Fan Xian's words and coldly said, "If I remember correctly, that was the work of the young lady of the Sun family. What does it have to do with her father?" The young lady of the Sun family was always her father's child. Fan Xian raised his head and looked at the emperor stubbornly and calmly. The emperor put down the file in his hand and also raised his head. He looked calmly at his son and was silent for a long time. It was as if he wanted to see the true thoughts in the depths of his heart. A moment later, he quietly said, "You came to the palace today to say this?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The emperor once again fell silent. After a long time he suddenly said, "Why?" "I am a person who always returns favors and grudges." The reason Fan Xian gave was simple. "I am greatly indebted to the young lady of the Sun family. If you only want to repay the favor." The emperor said mockingly, "I gave Sun Pin'er to you. Naturally, Sun Jingxiu's face will be bright. Why fight for this position?" Fan Xian did not smile in embarrassment. His face was incomparably calm, but his heart tightened slightly. Gritting his teeth, he said through his teeth, "Because you promised me 3 years ago." The emperor sank into silence. 3 years ago, Fan Xian had asked him for credit. Among them was the matter of Sun Jingxiu. He slowly opened his mouth and said, "What in this world never changes? The position of an official is the foundation of a country. How can it never change because of one word? Based on your words, if I promise you something, even if that person is corrupt and breaks the law in the future, I will still follow you and not touch him?" Fan Xian's earlier words carried a glimmer of anger and a glimmer of unbecoming ferocity. The emperor was angered by this intention of using his achievements to ask for rewards. In an instant he calmed down. Perhaps the emperor liked Fan Xian's personality of putting everything on the table to argue. Sun Jingxiu is a capable official. Fan Xian did not take a step back. Looking at the emperor's face, he said in a clear voice, "If he dares to take bribes and bend the law, I will be the first to capture him and hack him to pieces." A strange light flashed through the emperor's eyes. It was as if he had not thought that Fan Xian would care so much about this matter. He faintly thought that it was probably because the method of reducing power had come too quickly and pierced this young man's heart. The Dongyi matter was still being dealt with. The court had not truly rewarded Enji for his service, yet they were in a rush to arrange an opponent for him in court. No wonder Enji felt uncomfortable and forcefully pushed back. The emperor smiled slightly, thinking he understood Fan Xian's thoughts. He shook his head and didn't continue on the matter. "A routine performance appraisal will always have to be done." The emperor lowered his head and said evenly. "Since you want to repay Sun Jingxiu's kindness in the past, I will not force you to be an unjust person. However, if he is not suitable to continue in this position, I will replace him. The emperor raised his head. It seemed to be a warning and also a reminder. Even if you are the director of the Overwatch Council, you cannot interfere too much with the matters of the court. The students of the Hall of Governmental Affairs work hard on court affairs. Don't interfere too much. Fan Xian didn't say anything more. He lowered his body in a bow and left the royal study. In these last two sentences, the emperor had already expressed very clearly that he would not personally interfere in this matter. However, He Zongwei would still act against Sun Jingxiu. Furthermore, he reminded Fan Xian not to make any secret moves against He Zongwei. Otherwise the emperor would truly be angry. After Fan Xian left, the emperor glanced helplessly at the files on the table. A faint annoyance rose in his heart. With one hand he pushed the files away and sat alone in the royal study. No one knew what he was thinking. Everything about Enji is good. It's just that his personality is too direct and stubborn. As the emperor thought to himself, he summoned eunuch Yao in and asked him about what had happened in Jingdo. His expression gradually calmed. Hearing about the matter of the birthday banquet in Sun Manor, the emperor thought deeply for a long time. He understood why Fan Xian had jumped up like an old cat whose tail had been stepped on. An official who had just performed a great service was about to have his power reduced and his face swept away. Perhaps anyone would feel angry, let alone Fan Xian. Perhaps this matter was a bit too rushed, the emperor thought to himself. He did not want to admit that he had overlooked something. Coldly he said to eunuch Yao, "Tell He Zongwei to do as he pleases. As for Enji, don't worry about it for now." The emperor had not thought that Fan Xian's anger was mostly faked. He only wanted to use his anger and sadness to force the emperor's heart to be moved and unable to bear to bully him. He wanted to keep the power in his hands for a while longer. Eunuch Yao respectfully responded. Immediately after, he lowered his voice and said, "That matter has been investigated to its end." The emperor made a sound of acknowledgement. A cold light flashed through his eyes as he said, "Speak." The dispatch order from the third workshop and the order for the city guarding crossbows to leave North Min have both been obtained. However, when we finally found the transfer order from the Bureau of Military Affairs, it pointed to the Qin family. We couldn't see a shadow of that side, eunuch Yao said in a trembling voice. The internal court had been secretly investigating the attack in the valley for the past year. The emperor had never let go of the suspicions from back then. He wholeheartedly wanted to capture that person and comfort Sir Fan Jr. To be able to do so many things without a sound and to have his hands and feet probed into the palace treasury was something that even the Qin family, once a member of the military, could not do. Furthermore, he did not leave behind any clues after the matter. In the entire Qin kingdom, other than the emperor himself, there were only the people of the Overwatch Council. The emperor's expression was complicated. He was a very vengeful and sensitive person. Presently, the situation under heaven could be anticipated. Although there were some small problems within the court, there was nothing that could threaten the foundation of the Li family's rule. Thus, the attack in the valley had become a thorn in his heart. Not only because someone had almost killed his son, but also because he had discovered that that person had faintly broken away from his control. Just like Fan Xian now, it seemed that he was also showing signs of breaking away from his control. As for Fan Xian, he could temporarily tolerate him because he was his own son, his most beloved son, and the son who had done the most for the Qin kingdom. As for that person had done even more for the Qin kingdom. Furthermore, the emperor still had not figured out the reason. He sat tiredly on the soft couch as if he didn't want to continue thinking about this matter. After a long silence he said, "The investigation of the valley ends here. In any case, they are all people who are about to die. Have you found out the person behind the two eunuchs?" Eunuch Yao's temples burned with pain. He shook his head in fear. He knew who the two eunuchs the emperor was talking about were. This was another mystery behind the fog of the Qin kingdom. At the time, under the Empress Dowager's leadership, the entire Qin royal family was moving toward the crown prince's ascension. The second prince had also temporarily maintained peace with the crown prince. Coincidentally, two eunuchs jumped out of the palace with the intention of assassinating the third prince, Li Qingping. What exactly did they want to do? Furthermore, under the circumstances at the time, the third prince's life and death had no intrinsic effect on the crown prince's ascension. On the contrary, if the third prince had died tragically in the palace, it would have been an infamy that the crown prince and the second prince could not bear. Afterward, Fan Xian had investigated carefully, but the crown prince and the second prince did not admit to it. The eldest princess did not even talk about such a small matter before her death. Fan Xian could not continue investigating. He could only think that there were too many variables in the palace at that time. He didn't know what kind of conflict had exploded to put the third prince in danger. However, the emperor did not think this way. He never let go of any of the smallest oddities. That was why he was able to accomplish such a grand undertaking. Fan Xian walked out of the royal palace in the dark and ignored the eunuchs and serving girls who bowed humbly around him. He flicked his sleeves and left with a dark expression. When it came to his attitude toward servants, Fan Xian was definitely an anomaly in the Qing kingdom. Putting aside the servants and serving girls in the Fan manor, even toward the eunuchs and serving girls in the palace, his words were always gentle. Not only was he generous, but his attitude was also very different. It was as if he never thought there was anything to hate about these abnormal people. Because of this, the people in the royal palace all had a heartfelt respect and love for this little duke. Although Eunuch Ho, who had died to the arrows of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council 3 years ago, was someone the eldest princess had secretly planted, he was usually full of praise for Fan Xian. Fan Xian's unusual behavior fell into the eyes of many people. This behavior was very different from his usual behavior. These eunuchs and serving girls all felt a glimmer of strangeness. They all guessed that the little duke was probably arguing with the emperor in the royal study again. Walking out of the dark and secluded palace gate, Fan Xian stood on the square in front of the royal palace. He didn't turn his head to look at the palace gate. Instead, he spread his arms and let out a loud cry. It was as if he wanted to vent all the depression in his chest with this cry. His voice echoed through the silent and empty square. It crashed against the red wall of the royal palace and then turned back. It lingered for a long time without stopping. The guards inside the palace gate, the imperial soldiers outside, and the eunuchs who were about to drop the key all turned their gazes toward him. They were all startled by this voice. If it had been a normal person yelling like this at the palace gate, the imperial soldiers would probably have long rushed forward and given him a good beating. Then, they would be sent to the celestial prison to wait for the fall beheading for the crime of disturbing the palace. However, no one dared to move even after Fan Xian's random yell. There wasn't even a verbal reminder. Even if this person had gone crazy if he was Fan Xian, then everyone would only beautify it as the madness of a poet and turn a blind eye to it. The person on duty at the palace gate was the commander of the imperial army, Gong Dian. He was the first official Fan Xian had seen after entering the capital. The two of them could be considered to be familiar. Hearing this cry, Gong Dian ran out from the duty room and hurried over. Dragging him back, he said, "What's wrong with you?" Fan Xian tidied the sleeves on his arm and smiled coldly. "I'm really about to go crazy." Although he said this, his expression had already calmed a great deal. Earlier he indeed had some anger that needed to be vented. After enduring in this world until now, in front of everyone, Fan Xian no longer needed to hide anything or go against his nature. Other than the emperor, acting in front of the emperor was indeed very stressful. Furthermore, his emotions were very complicated. Looking at the emperor's thin and tired face, for some reason Fan Xian thought of the portrait in the little building and the story from many years ago. A wave of blood and fire gathered in Fan Xian's eyes. He found it difficult to bear the feeling of being torn apart by these mixed feelings. Even though he was yelling in front of the palace gate, Fan Xian was actually acting. He knew that before long, this yell would be reported to the emperor's ears in the royal study. He wanted to act like a real person, an angry and wronged illegitimate child. It was very tiring. He didn't want to act anymore. "Accompany me to drink." He stared at Gong Dian like a refugee staring at a piece of pork belly. "I'll seal up Baoyue brothel and call 60 girls to accompany you." Truly, truly crazy. Gong Dian's eyes were bright and full of expression as he stared back at him. He placed a hand on his forehead. There was a manor by the side of Xinhuai Alley. This residence did not take up a large amount of space. The overhanging eaves and walls were not very magnificent. Its location was also not very good. It intersected with the surrounding private residences and was not very different. This manor belonged to an old imperial censor of the previous dynasty. After this old imperial censor retired and returned to his hometown, the residence was left empty and handed to a few old colleagues to manage. Thinking that it would be more convenient for his descendants when they sought a future in Jingdo, he had no intention of selling it. 3 years ago this manor was still sold. From then on, the quiet Xinhuai Alley became lively. Occasionally officials would come to visit. During the New Year and other festivals, the crowd at the entrance was like a dragon. It was extraordinarily lively. Following the gradual promotion of the new master of the imperial censor's manor, There were fewer and fewer officials who came to visit because the new master's incorruptible reputation gradually spread. No one wanted to touch his bad luck. The imperial censor of the left, the traveling scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, He Zongwei, was the new master of this imperial censor's manor. In reality, his colleagues had all advised against it. Even the emperor had once mentioned that most of the officials lived in the south of the city. It was inconvenient for He Zongwei to live in the old imperial censor's manor in Xinhuai Alley. Furthermore, it did not match the dignity of a court official. Scholar He, who was in the same light as the dust in court matters, deeply understood the samadhi of officialdom, and was greatly appreciated by the emperor and admired by his colleagues, was very insistent on this matter. He even refused the emperor's edict to bestow him a residence. He still brought his 2 or 3 loyal servants, a widowed aunt, and a few distant brothers to live in this old imperial censor's manor. He lived there for 3 years. He Zongwei pushed open the door and walked into the somewhat dilapidated courtyard of the old imperial censor's manor. Looking at the messy spring scenery and the green leaves scattered everywhere, he couldn't help but shake his head self-mockingly. The reason he had always lived in this old imperial censor's manor was because he had feelings for it. Furthermore, this manor represented many important meanings to his life. The first time He Zongwei truly stepped onto the stage of the Qing kingdom was when Prime Minister Lin Ruofu resigned from his post 5 years ago. He Zongwei coincidentally met the wife of the Prime Minister's strategist, Wu Bohan. Feeling indignant, he went to the imperial censor to file a complaint against the emperor. He then coincidentally met the Prime Minister's killer. He then coincidentally met the second prince and the heir, Li Hongqing. After a series of coincidences, he coincidentally followed the general trend of the Qing court at the time and forcefully brought down Prime Minister Lin Ruofu. He Zongwei, who had missed the spring examinations because he was in mourning, was still a commoner. In everyone's eyes, he had brought down a treacherous prime minister with the strength of an ordinary man. At that moment his reputation rose. In the hearts of scholars, no one saw him as just a Jingdo talent on par with Hou Jichang. Instead, they saw him as a remarkable figure with great ambition and a determined temperament. It was also through the incident of Prime Minister Lin's fall that He Zongwei was able to see the emperor's face for the first time. From that day on, he was deeply convinced by the emperor's bearing and schemes. It was also that day that the emperor also took a fancy to this young scholar. With an imperial edict, he had him enter the imperial censor and become an imperial censor. In the following years He Zongwei dealt with various powers and finally successfully ascended. He became the youngest scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs in the history of the Qing kingdom. His limelight flourished and was unparalleled. Of course, that was because no one would compare him to that person. Even though he was scholar He, in the hearts of thousands of people in the Qing kingdom, that person would forever be the only one, the high and lofty one. In He Zongwei's heart, that person was a shadow. This shadow floated above his head and blocked out the limitless light of his life, leaving only a patch of darkness and coldness. That shadow was Fan Xian. When He Zongwei received the unanimous praise of the scholars because of Prime Minister Lin's matter, Fan Xian had already exposed the scandal of the spring examination and made 15 officials of the court, including the Minister of the Board of Rights, dead people. Furthermore, there was also the poem that night in front of the palace. When He Zongwei was still a common imperial censor in the imperial censor, Fan Xian was already the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. He had forced the emperor to beat the imperial censors in front of the royal palace. Those imperial censors were He Zongwei's seniors and superiors. When He Zongwei finally welcomed the most glorious moment of his life, Fan Xian still only looked at him with disdain. With one hand he held the Overwatch Council, with the other he held the palace treasury. Now he had seized back a large piece of land for the Qing kingdom, Dongyi. He was a talent, and the other was an immortal poet. He was a scholar, and the other was the Duke of Dambua. Most importantly, he was just a poor child of a poor family, and the other was the emperor's illegitimate child. No matter when, no matter where, Fan Xian firmly pressed down on him until he almost couldn't breathe. He Zongwei looked at the spring garden in front of him. He looked at the messy grass growing without anyone taking care of it and sank into silence. He knew that in this life, no matter how hard he worked, he would never be able to surpass that person. He Zongwei slowly closed his eyes and sighed helplessly. He had great confidence in his abilities and willpower. He didn't think he was any worse than Fan Xian. However, fate had long decided this. What could he do? He heard that Sir Yin Jr. of the Overwatch Council kept a few vicious dogs at home, forcing no court officials to visit. He also heard that Fan Xian kept countless guards at home. If anyone shamelessly came to give gifts, they would all be chased out of the manor. He Zongwei's manor couldn't afford to keep dogs or people, but it had raised a black face. In order to maintain his impartial and incorruptible image, He Zongwei had paid a great price. Furthermore, he could not be as unreasonable as the two people in the Overwatch Council. He had to reject bribes and also not make the other party feel uncomfortable. Thus He Zongwei was also very tired. At least he thought he was much more tired than Fan Xian. The salary of court officials was not much. It was only 1/3 of the salary of officials of the same rank in the Overwatch Council. Additionally, He Zongwei had a reputation for being incorruptible, so it was difficult to maintain the manor's expenses. Although the emperor knew of his family's poverty and had the internal court bestow a great deal of gold and silver, traveling to and from Jingdo was always too expensive. What He Zongwei worried about the most was not Sun Jingxiu of the Jingdo government but whether or not he should spend money to repair the garden. He Zongwei let out a bitter laugh. Who knew how much he had sacrificed for the sake of such glory? He was not like Fan Xian, who had a large palace treasury to support and a bookstore and brothel to support him. Strangely, the harder his life was, the calmer He Zongwei's expression was and the happier he felt. It was as if there was a kind of painful torture that could make him truly understand the meaning of his existence. He wanted to do great things for the court. He wanted to become a truly famous official. He Zongwei's eyes grew brighter and brighter. Looking at the chaotic spring garden in the night, he didn't say a word. He only thought to himself, Fan Xian had indeed gone to the Sun Manor today. When the Hall of Governmental Affairs discussed matters tomorrow, what kind of attitude should I have? Earlier, the eunuch in the palace had brought the emperor's verbal edict. It had made his heart more at ease, but it had also made it more depressing. I have to find another way. He Zongwei lowered his head in the night wind. What great things! What famous official! Under Fan Xian's pressure, he had to first ensure that he could continue living after the emperor died. Thus, before the emperor died, he had to let Fan Xian die first. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.